Welcome to this compilation of 5 thought-provoking science fiction short stories. I'll be narrating Moral Equivalent by Kris Neville, Crossroads of Destiny by H. Beam Piper, Do Unto Others by Mark Clifton, A Matter of Order by Fox B. Holden, and The Skull by Philip K. Dick. If you'd like to listen without ad breaks in audio or video format, and get access to narrations of full novels 6 months in advance, consider signing up to my Patreon at patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Moral Equivalent by Kris Neville. Narrated by William Sky. Why shouldn't a culture mimic another right down to the last little detail? Because the last detail may be just that, the final one. The planet Lanet 2 had dwindled to a luminous speck. They were in clear space now, at break-off point. Belyakov held the ship in position, while Kelly set dials for the jump into the hyperspatial drift opening, which deep space men knew as the slot. Belyakov cracked his bony knuckles nervously. "Now, Johnny," he said. "Easy this time. Real easy. Gentle her into it. She's not a new ship. She resents being slammed into the slot." "She'll take it," Kelly said with a boyish grin of almost suicidal abandon. "Maybe she will, but how about us? You sort of creased the slot getting us off Toriang. A little closer and I was still getting the touch. You ought to be glad I'm an instinctive astrogator." He set the last dial with a rapid twirl and reached for the kiss-off switch. "You're out 2 decimal points," said Belyakov, who worried about such trifles. "Enough to ionize us." I know, Kelly grumbled, adjusting the dial. "I was just touching it for luck. Here we go." He depressed the kiss-off switch. Belyakov shut his eyes as the ship lurched slotward, wishing that Kine, their government-inspected, college-graduated astrogator, was still aboard. Kine had been an expert at the job. But then, 3 planets back, he had suddenly gone after a native stevedore with a micro-edge cleaver, screaming that no dirty alien would ever marry his daughter. Kine had no daughter. Currently, he was confined in Azalith, awaiting transportation Earthside to a padded little homey room in the spaceman's snug port. "How about that?" Kelly asked proudly once the ship was locked in hyperspace. "Superior intelligence and steel nerves do the trick every time." "Poor devil, Kine," Belyakov sighed. "A paranoid," Kelly diagnosed. "Did he ever tell you about the plot to keep him out of the Lunar Military Academy?" "He never talked to me much." "That's because you're a cold, distant, unsympathetic type," Kelly said with a complacent smile. "Me, he told everything. He applied to Luna every year, studied all the textbooks on military organization, land tactics, sea tactics, space strategy, histories of warfare, crammed his cabin with that junk, knew it inside out. Fantastic memory." "Why didn't he get in?" "Haemophilia. He couldn't pass the physical. He thought they were plotting against him. Still, I'm grateful for the chance at a little astrogation." With the barest hint of a smile, Kelly said, "I understand it's possible to bring a ship sidewise through the slot at Terra." "Please don't try," Belyakov begged, shuddering. "I knew we should have waited for Kine's replacement at Mala. We'd still be there, with a cargo of kvash turning sour." "I was afraid it was sour anyhow," Belyakov said with a warrior's knack for finding trouble. "Mala is the slowest loading port this side of the rift. I must admit, however, they didn't do badly this time." "Notice that, did you?" Kelly asked. Did you find a way of speeding them up?" "Sure, gave them Kine's old dog-eared books. They're crazy about books. Really hustled for them." Belyakov said nothing for several seconds, but his long, sallow face became pale. "You what?" "Gave them the books. Don't worry," Kelly said quickly. "Kine gave them to me before they hauled him away." "You gave the warfare books to the people on Mala?" "You mean I shouldn't have? Why not? What's wrong with Mala?" "Plenty." Belyakov grimly did some quick figuring. "It'll be a year their time when we can get back. Kelly, take us out of hyperspace." "Now?" Kelly gasped. "Here?" "At once." "But we might come out inside a star or—" "That," Belyakov said, his voice filled with righteousness, "simply cannot be helped. We must return at once to Mala." General Drac, commander of the forces of the Empress, wearer of the Gold Star of Mala, sat at his desk in the Supreme Command Post, which had recently been converted from a hardware store. He was engaged in a fiery argument over the telephone with Nob, the Empress's right-hand man. "But damn it all," General Drac shouted, "I must have it. I am the Supreme Commander, the General of all the armies of the dictatorship. Doesn't that mean anything?" "Not under the circumstances," Nob answered. Two soldiers standing guard in the General's quarters listened interestedly. "Think he'll get it?" one asked. "Not a chance," the other answered. Drac glared them into silence, then returned to the argument. "Will you please attempt to understand my position?" he said hoarsely. "You put me in command. At my orders, the armies of the dictatorship move against the allied democracies. All the other generals obey me. Me! Correct?" "He's got a point," one soldier said. "He'll never get it," the other replied. "Shut up, you two!" Drac roared. "Nob, aren't I right? It's the earthly way, Nob. Authority must be recognised." "I'm sorry," Nob said. "Extremely sorry. Personally, I sympathise with you. But the Book of Terran rank equivalents is quite specific. 7 shoulder stars are the most, the absolute most, that any general can wear. I absolutely cannot allow you to wear 8. "But you gave Frick 7, and he's just unit general." "That was before we understood the rules completely. We thought there was no limit to the number of stars we could give, and Frick's was sulky. I'm sorry, General, you'll just have to be satisfied with 7. "Take one away from Frick's, then." "Can't. He'll resign." "In that case, I resign." "You aren't allowed to. The book, Military Leadership, specifically states that a Supreme Commander never resigns during hostilities. An Earthman would find the very thought inconceivable." "All right!" Drac furiously slammed down the telephone. The two soldiers exchanged winks. "At attention, you two," Drac said. "You're supposed to be honour guards. Why can't you act like honour guards?" "We haven't got weapons," one of the soldiers pointed out. "Can't be helped. I sent what we had to the front." "But we need them here," the soldier said earnestly. "It's bad for morale, us not having weapons, and morale is vital for victory." Drac hated to be lectured, but he had to accept textbook truth when it was quoted at him. "You may be right," he agreed. "I'll try to get some back." He rubbed his eyes tiredly. Everything had happened so quickly. Just a week ago, Nob had walked into his store and inquired, "Drac, how would you like to be a general?" "I don't know," Drac had confessed honestly. "What is it, and why do we need one?" "War starting," Nob said. "You've heard of war, haven't you? Earth idea, very earthly. I'll explain later how it works. What do you say?" "All right, but do you really think I'm the right type?" "Absolutely. Besides, your hardware store is perfectly situated for the Supreme Command post." But aside from the location of his hardware store, Drac had other qualifications for leadership. For one thing, he looked like an Earth general, and this had loomed large in Nob's eyes. Drac was over 6 feet tall, strongly built, solidly muscled. His eyes were grey, deep-set and fierce. His nose was aquiline. His mouth was firm because he usually held nails in it when he was out on a repair job. In his uniform, Drac looked every inch a general. As a matter of fact, he looked like several generals, for his cap came from the Earth-Mars War of '82, his tunic was a relic of the Diarali campaign, his belt was in the style of the Third Empire, his pants were a replica of the Southern Star Front, while his shoes reminded one of the hectic days of the Fanzani Rebellion. But at least all his clothes were soldiers' clothes. His honour guard had to piece out their uniforms with personal articles. They had complained bitterly about the injustice of this, and had come close to deserting. But Drac, after some hasty reading in Smoggott's leadership, told them about the Terran doctrine of the privileges of rank. In front of him now was a report from the Alani battlefront. He wasn't sure what it said, since it was coded and he had neglected to write down the code. Was it "Enemy repulsed us with heavy losses," or should it read "Us repulsed enemy with heavy losses"? He wished he knew. It made quite a difference. The door burst open and a young corporal rushed in. "Hey, General, take a look out the window." Drac started to rise, then reconsidered. Rules were rules. "Hey, what?" he demanded. "Forgot," the corporal said. "Hey, sir, take a look out the window, huh?" "Much better." Drac walked to the window and saw, in the distance, a mass of ascending black smoke. "City of Chando," the corporal said proudly. "Boy, we smacked it today. Saturation bombing for 10 hours. They can't use it for anything but a gravel pit now." "Sir," Drac reminded. "Sir, the planes are fueled up and waiting. What shall we flatten next, huh, sir?" "Let me see." General Drac examined a wall map upon which the important enemy cities were circled in red. There were Alice and Drin, Kiss and Moss and Deletra. Drac could think of no reason for levelling one more than another. After a moment's thought, he pushed a button on his desk. "Yeah?" asked a voice over the loudspeaker. "Which one, Ingif?" "Kiss, of course," said the cracked voice of his old hardware store assistant. "Fellow over there owes us money and won't pay up." "Thanks, Ingif." Drax turned to the corporal. "Go to it, soldier." "Yes, sir." The corporal hurried out. General Drax turned back to the reports on his desk, trying again to puzzle out what had happened to Alani. Repulsed us? Us repulsed? How should it read? "Oh well," Drax said resignedly. "In the long run, I don't suppose it really makes much difference." Miles away, in no man's land, stood a bunker of reinforced concrete and steel. Within the bunker were two men. They sat on opposite sides of a plain wooden table, and their faces were stern and impassive. Beside each man was a pad and pencil. Upon each pad were marks. Upon the table between them was a coin. "Your toss," said the man on the right. The man on the left picked up the coin. "Call it." "Heads." It came up heads. "Damn," said the flipper, passing the coin across the table and standing up. The other man smiled faintly, but said nothing. Kelly reached for the kiss-off switch, then hesitated. "Look, Igor," he said, "do we have to come out now, without charts? It gets risky, you know. How can we tell what's out there in normal space?" "It's a risk we have to take," Belyakov said, stonily. "But why? What's wrong with the people of Mala having those books? Believe me, there's nothing dirty in them." "Look," Belyakov said patiently, "you know that Mala is a semi-restricted planet. Limited trading is allowed under control conditions. No articles are allowed on the planet except those on the approved list." "Yeah," Kelly said vaguely. "Silly sort of rule." "Not at all. Mala is a mirror culture. They consider Earth and its ways to be absolute perfection. They copy everything of Earth's they can find." "Seems like a good idea. We have got a real good culture." "Sure, but we developed into it. The Malans simply copy what they see, with no underlying tradition or rationale. Since they don't know why they're doing any particular thing, they can easily misinterpret it, warp it into something harmful." "They'll learn," Kelly said. "Of course they will, but in the meantime the results can be devastating. They always are when a primitive race tries to ape the culture of a more advanced people. Look at what happened to the South Sea Islanders. All they picked up was the worst of French, British and American culture. You hardly see any more South Sea Islanders, do you? Same with the American Indians, with the Hottentots, and plenty of others." "I still think you're making too much of a fuss about it," Kelly said. "All right, I gave them a lot of books on warfare and political organisation. So what? What in blazes can they do with them?" "The Malans," Belyakov said grimly, "have never had a war." Kelly gulped. "Never?" "Never. They're a completely cooperative society. Or were before they started reading those warfare books." "But they wouldn't start a war just because they've got some books on it and know that Earth people do it and... yeah, I guess they would." Quickly he set the dials. "You're right, buddy. We have an absolute moral obligation to return and straighten out that mess." "I knew you'd see it that way," Belyakov said approvingly. "And there is the additional fact that the Galactic Council could hold us responsible for any deaths traceable to the books. It could mean Ranhachi prison for 100 years or so." "Why didn't you say that in the first place?" Kelly flipped the kiss-off switch. The ship came out in normal space. Fortunately, there was no sun or planet in its path. "Hang on," Kelly said. "We're going where we're going in a great big rush." "I just hope we'll be in time to salvage something," Belyakov said, watching as their freighter ploughed its way through the sea of space toward the unchanging stars. With evident nervousness, Nob walked down a long, dim corridor toward the Imperial chambers, carrying a small package in both hands. The Prime Minister of the dictatorship was a small, bald man with a great bulging forehead and small, glittering black eyes made smaller by steel-rimmed spectacles. He looked the very incarnation of an evil genius, which was why he had been chosen as the power behind the throne. In point of fact, however, Nob was a mild, nearsighted, well-meaning little man, a lawyer by occupation, known throughout Mala for his prize rose gardens and his collection of Earth stamps. In spite of a temperamental handicap, he didn't find his new job too difficult. The Earth books were there, and Nob simply interpreted them as literally as possible. Whenever a problem came up, Nob thought, how would they solve it on Earth? Then he would do the same or as near the same as possible. But dealing with the Empress presented problems of a unique nature. Nob couldn't find a book entitled Ways and Means of Placating Royalty. If such a book were obtainable, Nob would have paid any price for it. He took a deep breath, knocked, and opened the door into the royal chambers. Instantly he ducked. A vase shattered against the wall behind him. Not so good, he thought, calculating the distance by which it had missed him. The Empress Juice's aim was improving. "Nob, you dirty swine!" the Empress shrieked. "At your service, Majesty," Nob answered, bowing low. "Where are the pearls, you insolent dolt?" "Here, Majesty," Nob said, handing over the package. "It's drained the exchequer buying them for you. The Minister of the Treasury threatened to desert to the enemy. He may still. The people are muttering about extravagance in high places. But the pearls are yours, Majesty." "Of course." Juicer opened the package and looked at the lustrous gems. "Can I keep them?" she asked in a very small voice. "Of course not." "I didn't think so," Juicer said sadly. She had been just another Malan girl, but had been chosen as Empress on the basis of her looks, which were heartbreakingly lovely. It was axiomatic that an Empress should be heartbreakingly lovely. The Malans had seen enough Earth films to know that. But an Empress should also be cold, calculating, cruel, as well as gracious, headstrong, and generous to a fault. She should care nothing for her people, while simultaneously all she cared for was the people. She should act in a manner calculated to make her subjects love her in spite of and because of herself. Juicer was a girl of considerable intelligence, and she wanted to be as earthly as the next. But the contradictions in her role baffled her. "Can't I keep them just for a little while?" she pleaded, holding a single pearl up to the light. "It isn't possible," Nob said. "We need guns, tanks, planes. Therefore you sell your jewellery. There are many Terran precedents." "But why did I have to insist upon the pearls in the first place?" Juicer asked. "I explained. As Empress you must be flighty, must possess a whim of iron, must have no regard for anyone else's feelings, must lust for expensive baubles." "All right," Juicer said. "All right what?" "All right, swine." "That's better," Nob said. "You're learning, Juicer. You really are. If you could just fluctuate your moods more consistently." "I really will try," promised the Empress. "I'll learn, Nob. You'll be proud of me yet." "Good. Now, there are some problems of state which you must decide upon. Prisoners of war, for one thing. We have several possible means for disposing of them." "You take care of it." Now, Nob chided. "Mustn't shirk your duty." "I'm not. I am simply being arbitrary and dictatorial. You solve it, pig, and bring me diamonds." "Yes, Excellency," Nob said, bowing low. "Diamonds. But the people—" "I love the people. But to hell with them," she cried, fire in her eyes. "Fine, fine," Nob said, and bowed his way out of the room. Juicer stood for a few moments in thought, then picked up a vase and shattered it on the floor. She made a mental note to order several dozen more. Then she flung herself upon the royal couch and began to weep bitterly. She was quite a young Empress, and she had the feeling of being in beyond her depth. The problems of the war and of royalty had completely ended her social life. She resented it. Any girl would. Nob, meanwhile, left the palace and went home in his armoured car. The car had been ordered to protect him against assassins, who, according to the Earth books, aimed a good deal of their plots at Prime Ministers. Nob could see no reason for this, since if he weren't Prime Minister, any one of 1,000 men could do the job with equal efficiency. But he supposed it had a certain symbolic meaning. He reached his home and his wife kissed him on the cheek. "Hard day at the palace, dear?" she asked. "Quite hard," Nob said. "Lots of work for after supper." "It just isn't fair," complained his wife. She was a plump, pleasant little person, and she worried continually about her husband's health. "They shouldn't make you work so hard." "But of course they should," said Nob, a little astonished. "Don't you remember what I told you? All the books say that during a war, a prime minister is a harried, harassed individual, weighed down by the enormous burden of state, unable to relax, tense with the numerous strains of high office." "It isn't fair," his wife repeated. "No one said it was, but it's extremely Earth-like." His wife shrugged her shoulders. "Well, of course, if it's Earth-like, it must be right. Come eat supper, dear." After eating, Nob attacked his mounds of paperwork, but soon he was yawning and his eyes burned. He turned to his wife, who was just finishing the dishes. "My dear," he said, "do you suppose you could help me?" "Is it proper?" she asked. "Oh, absolutely. The books state that the Prime Minister's wife tries in every way possible to relieve her husband of the burden of power." "In that case, I'll be happy to try." She sat down in front of the great pile of papers. "But, dear, I don't know anything about these matters." "Rely on instinct," Nob answered, yawning. "That's what I do." Flattered by the importance of her task, she set to work with a will. Several hours later, she awakened her husband, who was slumbering on the couch. "I've got them all finished, except these," she said. "In this one, I'm afraid I don't understand that word." Nob glanced at the paper. Oh, propaganda. That means giving the people the facts, whether true or false. It's very important in any war. I don't see why. It's obvious. To have a genuine Earth-style war, you need ideological differences. That's why we chose a dictatorship and the other continent chose a democracy. The job of propaganda is to keep us different. I see, she said dubiously. Well, this other paper is from General Hegelm of Security. He asks what you are doing about the spy situation. He says it's very serious. I'd forgotten about that. He's right. It's reached a crisis point. He put the paper in his pocket. I'm going to take care of that personally, first thing in the morning. In the last few hours, his wife had made no less than 8 major policy decisions, 20 codifications, 8 unifications, and 3 clarifications. Nob didn't bother to read them over. He trusted his wife's good judgment and common sense. He went to bed that night with the feeling of a job well done. And before he fell asleep, he figured out exactly what he would do about the spy situation. The next morning, Nob's orders went out by all means of communication. The results were gratifyingly swift, since the people of the dictatorship were completely behind the war and dutifully loved and hated their empress, in whose name the order was signed. A typical scene took place in the club car of the Charzil Express. The occupants of the car, 23 commuting businessmen, sealed the doors as soon as they received Nob's order. The best read among them, a salesman by the name of Thrang, was elected spokesman for the group. Boys, said Thrang, I guess I don't have to tell you anything about the importance of this order. We all know what war is by now, don't we? We sure do. War is hell. The war that the enemy thrust on us. The war to start all wars. That's right, Thrang said. And I guess we've all felt the pinch since the war started. Eh, boys? I've done my part, said a man named Draxel. When the Prime Minister called for a cigarette shortage, I dumped 20 carloads of tobacco in the Hunto River. Now we got a cigarette rationing. That's the spirit, Thrang said. I know for a fact that others among you have done the same with sugar, canned goods, butter, meat, and 100 items. Everything's rationed now. Everyone feels the pinch. But boys, there's still more we have to do. Now a spy situation has come up, and it calls for quick action. Haven't we done enough? Groaned a clothing store owner. It's never enough. In time of war, Earth people give till it hurts, then give some more. They know that no sacrifice is too much, that nothing counts but the proper prosecution of the war. The clothing store owner nodded vehemently. If it's earthly, it's good enough for me. So what can we do about this spy situation? That is for us to decide here and now, Thrang said. According to the Prime Minister, our dictatorship cannot boast a single act of espionage or sabotage done to it since the beginning of the war. The Chief of Security is alarmed. It's his job to keep all spies under surveillance. Since there are none, his department has lost all morale, which, in turn, affects the other departments. Do we really need spies? They serve a vital purpose, Thrang explained. All the books agree on this. Spies keep a country alert, on its toes, eternally vigilant. Through sabotage, they cut down on arms production, which otherwise would grow absurdly large, since it has priority over everything else. They supply security with subjects for interrogation, confession, brainwashing, and re-indoctrination. This in turn supplies data for the enemy propaganda machine, which in turn supplies material for our counter-propaganda machine. Draxel looked awed. I didn't know it was so complicated. That's the beauty of the Earth War, Thrang said. Stupendous yet delicate complications, completely interrelated. Leave out one seemingly unimportant detail, and the whole structure collapses. Those Terrans, Draxel said, shaking his head in admiration. Now to work. Boys, I'm calling for volunteers. Who'll be a spy? No one responded. Really now, said Thrang. That's no attitude to take. Come on, some of you must be harbouring treasonous thoughts. Don't be ashamed of it. Remember, it takes all kinds to make a war. Little Herg, a zipper salesman from Succoth, cleared his throat. I have a cousin who's Minister of War for the Allies. An excellent motive for subversion, Thrang cried. I rather thought it was, the zipper salesman said, pleased. Yes, I believe I can handle the job. Splendid, Thrang said. By then the train had arrived at the station. The doors were unsealed, allowing the commuters to leave for their jobs. Thrang watched the zipper salesman depart, then hurried into the crowd. In a moment he found a tall man wearing a slouch hat and dark glasses. On his lapel was a silver badge which read Secret Police. See that man? Thrang asked, pointing to the zipper salesman. You bet, the secret policeman said. He's a spy, a dirty spy. Quick, after him. He's being watched, said the secret policeman laconically. I just wanted to make sure, Thrang said and started to walk off. He felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned. The secret policeman had been joined by 2 tall men in slouch hats and dark glasses. They wore badges that said Stormtroopers. "You're under arrest," said the secret policeman. "Why, what have I done?" "Not a thing as far as we know," said a stormtrooper. "Not a single solitary thing. That's why we're arresting you." "Arbitrary police powers," the secret policeman explained. "Suspension of search warrants and habeas corpus. Invasion of privacy. War, you know. Come along quietly, sir. You have a special and very important part to play in the war effort." "What's that?" "You have been arbitrarily selected as martyr," said the secret policeman. Head held high, Thrang marched proudly to his destiny. The whole of Mala took to war with a will. Soon books began to appear on the stalls, War and You for the masses, the erotic release of war for the elite, the inherent will to destroy for philosophers, and War and Civilization for scholars. Volumes of personal experiences sold well. Among them was an account of daring sabotage by a former zipper salesman, and the dramatic story of the martyrdom of Thrang. War eliminated 1,000 old institutions and unburdened the people of the heavy hand of tradition. War demonstrated clearly that everything was as temporary as a match flash, except art and man, because cities, buildings, parks, vehicles, hills, museums, monuments were as whispers of dust after the bombers had gone. Among the proletariat, the prevailing opinion was voiced by Zun, who was quoted as saying at a war plant party, "Well, there ain't nothing in the stores I can buy, but I never made so much money in my life." In the universities, professors boned up on the subject in order to fit themselves for chairs of war that were sure to be endowed. All they had to do was wait until the recent crop of war profiteers were taxed into becoming philanthropists, or driven to it by the sense of guilt that the books assured them they would feel. Armies grew. Soldiers learned to paint, salute, curse, appreciate home cooking, play poker, and fit themselves in every way for the post-war civilian life. They broadened themselves with travel and got a welcome vacation from home and hearth. War, the Malans agreed, was certainly one of the cleverest of Earth institutions, and as educational as it was entertaining. "Nope," Belyakov was saying. "You wouldn't like Ranhatchee Prison, not one little bit. It's on Mercury, you know, in the Twilight Zone. You blister by day and you freeze by night. Only 2 men have escaped from Ranhatchee in the last 100 years, and one of them figured his curve wrong and flipped into Sol." "What about the other one?" Kelly asked, perspiring lightly. "His gyros fused. He was bound straight for the coal sack. Take him a couple of 1,000 years to get there at his speed," Belyakov finished dreamily. "No, Johnny, you wouldn't like Ranhatchee." Okay, Kelly said. "The death penalty would be better." "They give that only as a measure of extreme clemency," Belyakov said with gloomy Slavic satisfaction. "Enough! We'll straighten out Mala." There was more hope than conviction in Kelly's voice. "There she lies, off to starboard." Mala was a tiny blue and brown sphere, suddenly growing larger in their screens. Their radio blared on the emergency channel. Kelly swore. "That's the Galactic Patrol Boat from Azalith. What's he doing here?" "Blockade," said Belyakov. "Standard practice to quarantine a planet at war. We can't touch down legally until the war's declared over." "Nuts, we're going down." Kelly touched the controls and the freighter began to descend into the interdicted area. "Attention, freighter," the radio blasted. "This is the interdictory ship Moth. Heave to and identify yourself." Belyakov answered promptly in the Propendium language. "Let's see him unscramble that," he said to Kelly. They continued their descent. After a while, a voice from the patrol boat said in Propendium, "Attention, freighter! You are entering an interdicted area. Heave to at once and prepare to be boarded." "I can't understand your vile North Propendium accent," Belyakov bellowed in a broad South Propendium dialect. "If you people can't speak a man's language, don't clutter up the ether with your ridiculous chatter. I know you long-haul trampers, and I'll be damned if I'll give you any air, water, food, or anything else. If you can't stock that stuff like any normal, decent—" "This area is interdicted," the patrol broke in, speaking now with a broad South Propendium accent. "Hell," Belyakov grumbled. "They've got themselves a robot linguist." "Under direct orders from the patrol boat Moth, heave to at once, freighter, and prepare to be boarded and inspected." Belyakov glanced at the planet looming large beneath them. He gestured at the power control to Kelly and said, "Hello? Hello? Do you read me? Your message is not coming across. Do you read me? Stop, or we'll fire." Belyakov nodded. Kelly kicked in all the jets and they plummeted toward the surface. With his pilot's sixth sense, Kelly changed course abruptly. A blast seared past them, sealing a starboard tube for good. Then they were in the atmosphere, travelling too fast, the hull glowing red with friction. The heavy cruiser, built only for spatial manoeuvring, broke off its pursuit curve. "All right, freighter, this means your license. You gotta leave sometime." Belyakov shut off the radio. Kelly fired the braking jets and began to spiral in for a landing. As they circled, Belyakov saw the shattered rubble and ruin where cities had been. He saw highways filled with military columns, and at the distant edge of the horizon, a fleet of military planes winging their way to a fresh target. "What a mess," he said. Kelly nodded glumly. They touched down and opened the hatches. Already a crowd of Malans had gathered. A few artists had set up their easels and were busy painting the freighter, not because it was lovely, but because it was Terran, which was better. A Malan stepped forward, grinning. "Well," he asked, "what do you think of it?" "Of what?" "Our war, of course. You must have noticed." "Oh yes, we noticed," Belyakov said. "A real intercontinental war complete with ideological differences," the man stated proudly. "Just like the civilized planets have. You must admit it's Earth-like." "Exceedingly Earth-like," Kelly said. "Now, take us to whoever's in charge. Quick!" The conference with Nob at the Imperial Palace began well. The Prime Minister was overjoyed that real Earthmen had come to witness their war. He knew very well that by Earth standards it was a pretty small war. A beginner's war, really. But they were trying. Some day, with more know-how, with better equipment, they would be able to produce a war that would match anyone's. "We were hampered from the start," Nob apologized, "by not knowing how to produce atomic fission." "That must have been confining," Kelly said, and Belyakov winced. "It was. Dynamite and nitroglycerin just don't have the same grandeur and finality. The scale of demolition seems insignificant. But if you will come with me, gentlemen, I have something here which may interest you." Nob ushered the Earthmen ahead of him so he could copy their loose-jointed rolling walk. "Here," he said, darting ahead and opening a door. "Behold!" The Earthmen saw, upon an ivory pedestal, a small model of an atomic bomb. "We worked until we mastered it at last," Nob said proudly. "With any luck, we'll be in production within the month and using them within the year. Now, I think I can safely say that Mala has come of age." Belyakov said, "No." "No what?" "No atom bombs." "But it's Earth-like to use atomic bombs. Why?" "This war has to end at once," Kelly said. "You're joking," protested Nob, looking intently at the Earthmen. But he saw at once that they were deadly serious. He groaned and sat down. Nob was faced with a moral dilemma of fearful proportions. On the one hand, war was a typical Terran institution, an extremely important one, an institution clearly worthy of emulation by the people of Mala. But on the other hand, this Terran institution was being refuted, denied in fact, by two typical Terrans. The problem was insoluble for him, and Nob remembered that when an ultimate crisis is at hand, that is the moment for the supreme authority to step in. "We must discuss this with the Empress," he said. He led them to Juice's chambers, knocked and opened the door. Half a dozen vases shattered around them. "On your knees, pigs!" Juice shrilled. "You, Nob, have you brought the diamonds?" "I knew I forgot something." "Forgot them? Then how dare you show your face?" Juice stamped her small foot. "And these peasants, who are they? I've a good mind to lock them up, especially that grinning red-headed ape." Kelly's grin became a trifle strained. "These are Earthmen, Your Majesty," Nob said. "Genuine Earthmen." "Really?" breathed Juicer. "Really," said Nob. "Oh, golly," Juicer said, losing all her painfully acquired imperial pose and becoming a frightened, albeit lovely, young girl. "Your Majesty," Belyakov began. "Just call me Juicer. My gosh, real Earthman. I never met a real Earthman before. I wish you had let me know in advance. My hair is beautiful, just like yourself," Kelly said. "I'm so glad. I think your hair is beautiful too." Kelly turned brick red. "You're not supposed to say that, you know." "I didn't know," Juicer said, "but I'm willing to learn. What should I have—" "Excuse me," Belyakov broke in sourly. "Your Majesty, we've come to ask you to stop the war." "You don't mean it!" Juicer turned bewilderedly to Kelly. "Have to do it, honey," Kelly said softly. "You folks just aren't ready for a war yet." Juicer's eyes flashed, and she began to regain a little of her imperial pose. "But of course we are. Look at what we've done. Go over our battlefields, look at our cities, interrogate our refugees. You'll find that everything has been done in strict accordance with the rules. We're as ready for war as anyone." "I'm sorry you'll have to stop it," Belyakov said, and Kelly nodded his agreement. Juicer gave Nob a beseeching look, but the Prime Minister averted his eyes. The dilemma was there again, enormous, insurmountable, and squarely on Juice's shoulders. To stop the war now would be unearth-like. To refuse the Earthmen was unthinkable. "I just don't know," Juice said. She looked at Kelly, who wore the guilty expression of a man caught murdering a fawn. Then she burst into tears and collapsed on a couch. Nob and the Earthman looked at each other, made several helpless gestures, and left. "What now?" Belyakov asked in the corridor. "Do you think she'll stop the war?" Nob shrugged his shoulders. "Who knows? It's a problem without a solution." "But she has to make up her mind," Kelly said. "That's one of the duties of authority." "The Empress is aware of that, and she will make up her mind, though it could take a year or more, unless she fails completely under the strain." "Poor kid," Kelly said. "She needs a man to help her out." "Indeed she does," Nob agreed hastily. "A strong man, a wise man, a man who could guide her and be as advisor and husband to her." Kelly blinked, then laughed nervously. "Don't look at me. I mean, she's a cute kid, nice girl, makes some man a wonderful wife, but I'm not the marrying kind, you know what I mean?" "Johnny," said Belyakov, "I'd like to have a serious talk with you." Nob led them to a vacant room and left discreetly. "I won't do it," Kelly declared bluntly. "You have to," Belyakov said. "You got us into this mess, now you can marry us out." "No, she'd make a wonderful wife," Belyakov quoted Kelly's words back at him. "Docile, pretty, but spirited. What more could you ask?" "Freedom of choice," Kelly said grimly. "That's for adolescents. Speaking. She'll never be able to make up her mind to stop the war unless you marry her. Until the war ends, that interdictory ship is going to sit in orbit waiting for us. You haven't anything to lose," Belyakov added. "I haven't? Not a thing. It's a big galaxy, and our freighter is always waiting." "That's true," Kelly admitted. 10 minutes later, Belyakov dragged him into the corridor. They were joined by Nob, who ushered them back to the Empress's chambers. "It's okay by me if it's okay by you, kid," Kelly blurted out in a tone that made Belyakov shudder and made Nob smile in outright hero worship. "What is all right?" Juicer asked. "Marriage," Kelly said. "What do you say?" Juicer studied his face for several seconds. "But do you love me?" "Give it time, kid, give it time." Juicer must have seen something in his expression, something behind the embarrassment and anger. Very softly she said, "I will be most happy to marry you." It was a double ring ceremony and authentically Terran. Belyakov produced a Bible from the freighter, and the ancient words of the Earth ceremony were read. When it was over, Kelly, grinning, perspiring, nervously rubbing his hands together, turned to his bride. "Now stop the war, honey." "Yes, dear," Juicer said dutifully. She heaved a great sigh. "What's wrong?" Kelly asked. "I just tremble to think of our cities being bombed out of existence, and us not able to do anything about it because we've stopped fighting." "What are you talking about? If we stop fighting—" "They won't," she said. "Why should they? It's Earth-like to continue conquering, and if we quit fighting, there'll be nothing to stop them from conquering us completely." "Nob!" Kelly shouted. "Igor! What can we do about this?" Nob said, "There would appear to be only one certain solution. I can arrange a meeting for you," he turned to Belyakov, "with Lanvi, the president of the Allies." "What would I say to him?" asked Belyakov. "To her," Nob corrected. "You can say, I suppose, the same sort of thing your friend said." Belyakov, ashy pale, started to back away. Kelly caught him in one meaty fist. "Okay, Mr. Fixer. Your duty is plain. Marry us out of trouble." "But I've got a girlfriend in Minsk." "She forgot you years ago. Stop squirming, buddy." "What does she look like?" Belyakov queried in apprehension. "Very pretty," Nob said. During the double ring ceremony, Belyakov peered at his bride with cautious approval. Lanvi was indeed a pretty girl, and she seemed to possess the Malan virtues of obedience, patience, and fire. As soon as the final words were spoken, the war was declared officially over. Peace, an authentic Earth custom, was proclaimed. "Now the real work begins," Belyakov said. "First we'll need a list of the casualties." "The what?" Nob asked. "Casualties." "I'm not sure I understand," said the Prime Minister. "Casualties. The number of people killed in the warfare." "Now wait a moment," Nob said, his voice trembling. "Do I understand you correctly? Are you trying to tell me that civilized people kill people in their wars? Do you mean that they leave people in the cities they bomb?" Kelly looked at Belyakov. Belyakov looked at Kelly. "Lord, Lord," murmured Kelly. Belyakov merely gulped. "Is it possible?" asked Nob. "Do civilized people really—" "Of course not," said Belyakov. Never, Kelly said. Nob pursed his lips. I've been wanting to ask a real authority, a genuine Earthman, some questions on the subject. Our texts were by no means complete, and some parts we couldn't understand at all, like the matter of determining victories. That's something we couldn't figure out. We decided you must use a complicated system of umpires. It was too much for us, so we built a bunker in no man's land and put a man from each side in it. They tossed coins to determine whose turn it was. The winning side would bomb an enemy city, after the occupants had been evacuated, of course. Of course, said Belyakov. It worked out rather well with the coins, Nob said. Law of averages, in fact. Substantially our system, said Kelly. Just the way we do it, Belyakov added. A few more questions, if you please, Nob said. Juicer, would you bring in the big war encyclopedia? Juicer and Lanvey had been gossiping on the other side of the room. They hurried out and returned with the great book. Now here, Nob said, opening the volume, it seems to imply— Wait, Belyakov broke in. He took the book from Nob's hands and flipped through it rapidly, then turned to Kelly. In a whisper, he said in propendium, It looks as though Kine blotted out all references to killing. Sure, exclaimed Kelly, brightening. I told you, he was a haemophiliac, a bleeder. Naturally, he'd cut out every single mention of bloodshed. This point, Nob began. Later, Belyakov said. Right now we'd like to get a few articles from our spaceship. He winked at Kelly, who winked back. It won't take a moment, and then we'll be only too happy to— Oh dear, said Nob. You mean you wanted the spaceship? What? Well, I assumed that you'd have no further use for it. Metal is hard to get nowadays, and it seemed only proper to erect heroic statues to both of you, the men who brought the institution of peace to Mala. Did I do something wrong? Not at all, Kelly said. Oh, not at all. Perfectly delighted. Not at— Johnny, said Belyakov. Sorry, Kelly apologized, a broken man. The brides stepped forward to claim their husbands. Peace and prosperity came to Mala under the deft guidance of their Terran leaders. In time, spaceships arrived and departed, but neither man showed any particular desire to board one, for their wives, docile, patient, yet fiery, proved more appealing than the lonely far reaches of space. Belyakov sometimes pondered the opportune melting down of their freighter. He was never able to discover who had signed the order, but all Mala knew the saying, an Earthman is easy to catch but hard to hold. He wondered whether that had been the true reason behind the order to scrap the ship. By this time, of course, he didn't really care. If his wife or Kelly's had been responsible, it was all the more reason to feel appreciated. Nob knew the answer, but he had other things on his mind. He lay awake, restless, until his wife asked worriedly what was wrong. I've been wondering, he said. Those war books that the Earthmen had us turn in. I never did understand why all those deletions were made. You know, the ones that made us figure out a way of deciding which side won. But the Earthmen said they used the very same system, she reminded him. And they wouldn't lie, would they? They would if it was for our good. That's what is known as diplomacy, dear. Statesmanship. Or politics. Interchangeable terms. She looked impressed. Oh, and? I've tried to question the crews of ships that land here. The answers are so evasive that I can't help thinking— Yes, dear, she prompted, that civilized people actually kill each other in wars. She turned a shocked face toward him. How can you think such a thing? What would be the advantage? Advantage, he repeated. Then his expression cleared and he fell back on his pillow, completely relaxed. I hadn't thought of that, dear. None, of course. It would really be too much, wouldn't it? No question of it, dear, she said. Now that that's settled, can you go to sleep? There was no answer. He was already snoring peacefully. Crossroads of Destiny by H. Beam Piper. Narrated by William Skye. No wonder he'd been so interested in the talk of whether our people accepted these theories. I still have the dollar bill. It's in my box at the bank, and I think that's where it will stay. I simply won't destroy it, but I can think of nobody to whom I'd be willing to show it, certainly nobody at the college, my history department colleagues least of all. Merely to tell the story would brand me irredeemably as a crackpot, but crackpots are tolerated, even on college faculties. It's only when they begin producing physical evidence that they get themselves actively resented. When I went into the club car for a nightcap before going back to my compartment to turn in, there were 5 men there sitting together. One was an army officer, with the insignia and badges of a staff intelligence colonel. Next to him was a man of about my own age, with sandy hair and a bony Scottish-looking face, who sat staring silently into a highball which he held in both hands. Across the aisle, an elderly man, who could have been a lawyer or a banker, was smoking a cigar over a glass of port, and beside him sat a plump and slightly too well-groomed individual who had a tall, colourless drink, probably gin and tonic. The fifth man, separated from him by a vacant chair, seemed to be dividing his attention between a book on his lap and the conversation in which he was taking no part. I sat down beside the sandy-haired man. As I did so and rang for the waiter, the colonel was saying, "No, that wouldn't. I can think of a better one. Suppose you have Columbus get his ships from Henry VII of England and sail under the English instead of the Spanish flag. You know, he did try to get English backing before he went to Spain, but King Henry turned him down. That could be changed." I pricked up my ears. The period from 1492 to the Revolution is my special field of American history, and I knew at once the enormous difference that would have made. It was a moment later that I realized how oddly the colonel had expressed the idea, and by that time the plump man was speaking. "Yes, that would work," he agreed. "Those kings made decisions most of the time on whether or not they had a hangover, or what some court favourite thought." He got out a notebook and pen and scribbled briefly. "I'll hand that to the planning staff when I get to New York. That's Henry VII, not Henry VIII, right? We'll fix it so that Columbus will catch him when he's in a good humour." That was too much. I turned to the man beside me. "What goes on?" I asked. "Has somebody invented a time machine?" He looked up from the drink he was contemplating and gave me a grin. "Sounds like it, doesn't it? Why no, our friend here is getting up a television programme. Tell the gentleman about it," he urged the plump man across the aisle. The waiter arrived at that moment. The plump man, who seemed to need little urging, waited until I had ordered a drink and then began telling me what a positively sensational idea it was. "We're calling it Crossroads of Destiny," he said. "It'll be a series, 1 half-hour show a week. In each episode, we'll take some historic event and show how history could have been changed if something had happened differently. We dramatise the event up to that point, just as it really happened, and then a commentary voice comes on and announces that this is the Crossroads of Destiny. This is where history could have been completely changed. Then he gives a resume of what really did happen, and then he says, 'But suppose so-and-so had done this and that instead of such and such.' Then we pick up the dramatisation at that point, only we show it the way it might have happened. Like this thing about Columbus. We'll show how it could have happened, and end with Columbus wading ashore with his sword in one hand and a flag in the other, just like the painting, only it'll be the English flag, and Columbus will shout, 'I take possession of this new land in the name of His Majesty Henry VII of England.'" He brandished his drink to the visible consternation of the elderly man beside him. "And then the sailors all sing 'God Save the King.'" Which wasn't written till about 1745, I couldn't help mentioning. "Huh?" The plump man looked startled. "Are you sure?" Then he decided that I was and shrugged. "Well, they can all shout 'God Save King Henry,' or 'St. George for England,' or something. Then at the end we introduce the programme guest, some history expert, a real name, and he tells how he thinks history would have been changed if it had happened this way." The conservatively dressed gentleman beside him wanted to know how long he expected to keep the show running. "The Crossroads will give out before long," he added. "The sponsor will give out first," I said. "History is just one damn crossroads after another." I mentioned in passing that I taught the subject. "Why, since the beginning of this century, we've had enough of them to keep the show running for a year." "We have about 20 already written and ready to produce," the plump man said comfortably, "and ideas for twice as many that the planning staff is working on now." The elderly man accepted that and took another cautious sip of wine. "What I wonder, though, is whether you can really say that history can be changed." "Well, of course," the television man was taken aback. One always seems to be when a basic assumption is questioned. "Of course, we only know what really did happen, but it stands to reason, if something had happened differently, the results would have been different, doesn't it?" "But it seems to me that everything would work out the same in the long run. There'd be some differences at the time, but over the years, wouldn't they all cancel out?" "Non, non, monsieur," the man with the book who had been outside the conversation until now told him earnestly. "Make no mistake, history can be changed." I looked at him curiously. The accent sounded French, but it wasn't quite right. He was some kind of a foreigner, though. I'd swear that he never bought the clothes he was wearing in this country. The way the suit fitted, and the cut of it, and the shirt collar, and the necktie. The book he was reading was Langmuir's Social History of the American People. Not one of my favourites, a bit too much on the doctrinaire side, but what a bookshop clerk would give a foreigner looking for something to explain America. What do you think, Professor? The plump man was asking me. It would work out the other way. The differences wouldn't cancel out, they'd accumulate. Say something happened a century ago to throw a presidential election the other way. You'd get different people at the head of the government, opposite lines of policy taken, and eventually we'd be getting into different wars with different enemies at different times, and different batches of young men killed before they could marry and have families, different people being born or not being born. That would mean different ideas, good or bad, being advanced. Different books written, different inventions, and different social and economic problems as a consequence. Look, he's only giving himself a century, the colonel added. Think of the changes if this thing we were discussing, Columbus sailing under the English flag, had happened. Or suppose Leif Erikson had been able to plant a permanent colony in America in the 11th century, or if the Saracens had won the Battle of Tours. Try to imagine the world today if any of those things had happened. One thing you can be sure of, any errors you make in trying to imagine such a world will be on the side of over-conservatism. The sandy-haired man beside me, who had been using his highball for a crystal ball, must have glimpsed in it what he was looking for. He finished the drink, set the empty glass on the stand tray beside him, and reached back to push the button. I don't think you realize just how good an idea you have here, he told the plump man abruptly. If you did, you wouldn't ruin it with such timid and unimaginative treatment. I thought he'd been staying out of the conversation because it was over his head. Instead, he had been taking the plump man's idea apart, examining all the pieces, and considering what was wrong with it and how it could be improved. The plump man looked startled, and then angry. Timid and unimaginative were the last things he'd expected his idea to be called. Then he became uneasy. Maybe this fellow was a typical representative of his lord and master, the faceless abstraction called the public. What do you mean? He asked. Misplaced emphasis. You shouldn't emphasize the event that could have changed history. You should emphasize the changes that could have been made. You're going to end this show you were talking about with a shot of Columbus wading up to the beach with an English flag, aren't you? Well, that's the logical ending. That's the logical beginning, the sandy-haired man contradicted. And after that, your guest historian comes on. How much time will he be allowed? Well, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. We can't cut the dramatization too short. And he'll have to explain, a couple of times, and in words of one syllable, that what we have seen didn't really happen. Because if he doesn't, the next morning, half the 12-year-old kids in the country will be rushing wild-eyed into school to slip the teacher the real inside about the discovery of America. By the time he gets that done, he'll be able to mumble a couple of generalities about vast and incalculable effects, and then it'll be time to tell the public about widgets, the really safe cigarettes, all filter and absolutely free from tobacco. The waiter arrived at this point, and the sandy-haired man ordered another rye highball. I decided to have another bourbon on the rocks, and the TV impresario said gin and tonic, absently, and went into a reverie which lasted until the drinks arrived. Then he came awake again. I see what you mean, he said. Most of the audience would wonder what difference it would have made where Columbus would have gotten his ships, as long as he got them and America got discovered. I can see it would have made a hell of a big difference. But how could it be handled any other way? How could you figure out just what the difference would have been? Well, you need a man who'd know the historical background, and you'd need a man with a powerful creative imagination, who is used to using it inside rigorously defined limits. Don't try to get them both in one. A collaboration would really be better. Then you work from the known situation in Europe and in America in 1492, and decide on the immediate effects. And from that you have to carry it along, step by step, down to the present. It would be a lot of hard and very exacting work, but the result would be worth it. He took a sip from his glass and added, Remember, you don't have to prove that the world today would be the way you set it up. All you have to do is make sure that nobody else would be able to prove that it wouldn't. Well, how would you present that? As a play with fictional characters and a plot. Time, the present, under the changed conditions. The plot, the reason the coward conquers his fear and becomes a hero, the obstacle to the boy marrying the girl, the reason the innocent man is being persecuted. We'll have to grow out of this imaginary world you've constructed and be impossible in our real world. As long as you stick to that, you're all right. Sure, I get that. The plump man was excited again. He was about half sold on the idea. But how will we get the audience to accept it? We're asking them to start with an assumption they know isn't true. Maybe it is in another time dimension, the colonel suggested. You can't prove it isn't. For that matter, you can't prove there aren't other time dimensions. Ha, that's it, the sandy-haired man exclaimed. World of alternate probability. That takes care of that. He drank about a third of his highball and sat gazing into the rest of it, in an almost yogic trance. The plump man looked at the colonel in bafflement. Maybe this alternate probability time dimension stuff means something to you, he said. Be damned if it does to me. Well, as far as we know, we live in a 4-dimensional universe, the Colonel started. The elderly man across from him groaned. 4th dimension? Good God, are we going to talk about that? It isn't anything to be scared of. You carry an instrument for measuring in the 4th dimension all the time. A watch. You mean it's just time? But that isn't... We know of 3 dimensions of space, the Colonel told him, gesturing to indicate them. We can use them for coordinates to locate things, but we also locate things in time. I wouldn't like to ride on a train or a plane if we didn't. Well, let's call the time we know, the time your watch registers, time A. Now, suppose the entire infinite extent of time A is only an instant in another dimension of time, which we'll call time B. The next instant of time B is also the entire extent of time A, and the next and the next. As in time A, different things are happening at different instants. In one of these instants of time B, one of the things that's happening is that King Henry VII of England is furnishing ships to Christopher Columbus. The man with the odd clothes was getting excited again. This, how you say, this alternate probability, it is a theory generally accepted in this country? Got it, the sandy-haired man said before anybody could answer. He set his drink on the stand tray and took a big jackknife out of his pocket, holding it unopened in his hand. How's this sound? He asked, and hit the edge of the tray with the back of his knife. Boom! Crossroads of destiny, he intoned, and hit the edge of the tray again. Boom! This is the year 1959, but not the 1959 of our world, for we are in a world of alternate probability, in another dimension of time, a world parallel to and coexistent with, but separate from our own, in which history has been completely altered by a single momentous event. He shifted back to his normal voice. Not bad, only 25 seconds, the plump man said, looking up from his wristwatch. And a trained announcer could maybe shave 5 seconds off that. Yes, something like that, and at the end we'll have another 30 seconds and we can do without the guest. But this alternate probability in another dimension, the stranger was insisting. Is this a concept original with you? He asked the Colonel. Oh no, that idea's been around for a long time. I never heard of it before now, the elderly man said, as though that completely demolished it. Then it is generally accepted by the scientist? No, the sandy-haired man relieved the Colonel. There's absolutely no evidence to support it, and scientists don't accept unsupported assumptions unless they need them to explain something, and they don't need this assumption for anything. Well, it would come in handy to make some of these reports of freak phenomena, like mysterious appearances and disappearances, or flying object sightings, or reported falls of non-meteoric matter, theoretically respectable. Reports like that usually get the ignore and forget treatment now. Then you believe that these other worlds of the alternate probability, they exist? No, I don't disbelieve it either. I have no reason to, one way or another. He studied his drink for a moment and lowered the level in the glass slightly. I've said that once in a while things get reported that look as though such other worlds in another time dimension may exist. There may have been whole books published by people who collect stories like that. I must say that academic science isn't very hospitable to them. You mean things sometimes, how you say, leak in from one of these other worlds? That has been known to happen? Things have been said to have happened that might, if true, be cases of things leaking through from another time world, the sandy-haired man corrected, or leaking away to another time world. He mentioned a few of the more famous cases of unexplained mysteries. The English diplomat in Prussia who vanished in plain sight of a number of people. The ship found completely deserted by her crew, the lifeboats all in place. Stories like that. And there's this rash of alleged sightings of unidentified flying objects. I'd sooner believe that they came from another dimension than from another planet. But as far as I know, nobody's seriously advanced this other time dimension theory to explain them. I think the idea's familiar enough, though, that we can use it as an explanation, or pseudo-explanation, for the programme, the television man said. Fact is, we aren't married to this Crossroads title yet. We could just as easily call it Fifth Dimension. That would lead the public to expect something out of the normal before the show started. That got the conversation back onto the show, and we talked for some time about it, each of us suggesting possibilities. The stranger even suggested one, that the Civil War had started during the Jackson administration. Fortunately, nobody else noticed that. Finally, a porter came through and inquired if any of us were getting off at Harrisburg, saying that we would be getting in 5 minutes. The stranger finished his drink hastily and got up, saying that he would have to get his luggage. He told us how much he had enjoyed the conversation, and then followed the porter toward the rear of the train. After he had gone out, the TV man chuckled. "Was that one an oddball?" he exclaimed. "Where the hell do you suppose he got that suit?" "It was a tailored suit," the Colonel said. "A very good one. And I can't think of any country in the world in which they cut suits just like that. And did you catch his accent?" "Phony," the television man pronounced. "The French accent of a Greek waiter in a fake French restaurant. In the Bronx." "Not quite. The pronunciation was all right for French accent, but the cadence, the way the word sounds were strung together, was German." The elderly man looked at the Colonel keenly. "I see your intelligence," he mentioned. "Think he might be somebody up your alley, Colonel?" The Colonel shook his head. "I doubt it. There are agents of unfriendly powers in this country, a lot of them, I'm sorry to have to say. But they don't speak accented English, and they don't dress eccentrically. You know there's an enemy agent in a crowd, pick out the most normally American type in sight, and you usually won't have to look further." The train ground to a stop. A young couple with hand luggage came in and sat at one end of the car, waiting until the other accommodations could be found for them. After a while it started again. I dallied over my drink and then got up and excused myself, saying that I wanted to turn in early. In the next car behind, I met the porter who had come in just before the stop. He looked worried, and after a moment's hesitation he spoke to me. "Pardon, sir, the man in the club car who got off at Harrisburg. Did you know him?" "Never saw him before. Why?" "He tipped me with $1 bill when he got off. Later I looked closely at it. I do not like it." He showed it to me, and I didn't blame him. It was marked $1 and United States of America, but outside that there wasn't a thing right about it. One side was grey, all right, but the other side was green. The picture wasn't the right one, and there were a lot of other things about it, some of them absolutely ludicrous. It wasn't counterfeit. It wasn't even an imitation of a United States bill. And then it hit me like a bullet in the chest. Not a bill of our United States. No wonder he had been so interested in whether our scientists accepted the theory of other time dimensions and other worlds of alternate probability. On an impulse, I got out 2 ones and gave them to the porter. Perfectly good United States Bank gold certificates. "You better let me keep this," I said, trying to make it sound the way he'd think a federal agent would say it. He took the bills, smiling, and I folded his bill and put it into my vest pocket. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I have no wish to keep it." Some part of my mind below the level of consciousness must have taken over and guided me back to the right car and compartment. I didn't realize where I was going till I put on the light and recognized my own luggage. Then I sat down, as dizzy as though the 2 drinks I had been a dozen. For a moment I was tempted to rush back to the club car and show the thing to the Colonel and the sandy-haired man. On second thought I decided against that. The next thing I banished from my mind was the adjective incredible. I had to credit it. I had the proof in my vest pocket. The coincidence arising from our topic of conversation didn't bother me too much either. It was the topic which had drawn him into it. And as the sandy-haired man had pointed out, we know nothing, one way or another, about these other worlds. We certainly don't know what barriers separate them from our own, or how often those barriers may fail. I might have thought more about that if I'd been in physical science. I wasn't. I was in American history. So what I thought about was what sort of country that other United States must be, and what its history must have been. The man's costume was basically the same as ours, same general style, but many little differences of fashion. I had the impression that it was the costume of a less formal and conservative society than ours, and a more casual way of life. It could be the sort of costume into which ours would evolve in another 30 or so years. There was another odd thing. I'd noticed him looking curiously at both the waiter and the porter, as though something about them surprised him. The only thing they had in common was their race, the same as every other passenger car attendant. But he wasn't used to seeing Chinese working in railway cars. And there had been that remark about the Civil War and the Jackson administration. I wondered what Jackson he had been talking about. Not Andrew Jackson, the Tennessee militia general who got us into war with Spain in 1810, I hoped. And the Civil War, that had baffled me completely. I wondered if it had been a class war or a sectional conflict. We'd had plenty of the latter during our first century, but all of them had been settled peacefully and constitutionally. Well, some of the things he'd read in Lingmuir's social history would be surprises for him too. It must have gotten mixed with his spendable money. It was about the size of ours, and I wondered how he had acquired enough of our money to pay his train fare. Maybe he'd had a diamond and sold it, or maybe he'd had a gun and held somebody up. If he had, I didn't know that I blamed him under the circumstances. I had an idea that he had some realization of what had happened to him, the book and the fake accent to cover any mistakes he might make. Well, I wished him luck, and then I unfolded the dollar bill and looked at it again. In the first place, it had been issued by the United States Department of Treasury itself, not the United States Bank or one of the state banks. I'd have to think over the implications of that carefully. In the second place, it was a silver certificate. Why, in this other United States, silver must have been an acceptable monetary metal, maybe equally so with gold, though I could hardly believe that. Then I looked at the picture on the grey obverse side and had to strain my eyes on the fine print under to identify it. It was Washington, all right, but a much older Washington than any of the pictures of him I had ever seen. Then I realised that I knew just where the crossroads of destiny for his world and mine had been. As every schoolchild among us knows, General George Washington was shot dead at the Battle of Germantown in 1777 by an English, or rather Scottish, officer, Patrick Ferguson, the same Patrick Ferguson who invented the breech-loading rifle that smashed Napoleon's armies. Washington today is one of our lesser national heroes, because he was our first military commander-in-chief. But in this other world, he must have survived to lead our armies to victory and become our first president, as was the case with the man who took his place when he was killed. I folded the bill and put it away carefully among my identification cards, where it wouldn't a second time get mixed with the money I spent, and as I did, I wondered what sort of a president George Washington had made, and what part in the history of that other United States had been played by the man whose picture appears on our dollar bills. General and President Benedict Arnold. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. Do Unto Others by Mark Clifton. Narrated by William Skye. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the natives of Capella 4, philosophers at heart, were not ones to ignore the golden rule. My Aunt Mattie, Matthew H. Toombs, is president of the Daughters of Terror. I am her nephew, the one who didn't turn out well. Christened Hapland Graves after Earth President Hapland, a cousin by marriage, the fellows at school naturally called me Happy Graves. Haphazard Graves, it should be, Aunt Mattie commented acidly the first time she heard it. It was her not very subtle way of reminding me of the way I lived my life and did things, or didn't do them. She shuddered at anything disorderly, which of course included me, and it was her beholden duty to right anything which to her appeared wrong. There won't be any evil to march on after you get through, Aunt Mattie, I once said when I was a child. I like now to think that even at the age of 6 I must have mastered the straight face, but I'm afraid I was so awed by her that I was sincere. That will do, Hapland, she said sternly. But I think she knew I meant it then, and I think that was the day I became her favourite nephew. For some reason, never quite clear to me, she was my favourite aunt. I think she liked me most because I was the cross she had to bear. I liked her most, I'm sure, because it was such a comfortable ride. A few billions spent around the house can make things quite comfortable. She had need of her billions to carry out her hobbies, or, as she called it, her life's work. Aunt Mattie always spoke in clichés because people could understand what you meant. One of these hobbies was her collection of flora of the universe. It was begun by her maternal grandfather, one of the wealthier plots, and increased as the family fortunes were increased by her father, one of the more ruthless Toombs. But it was under Aunt Mattie's supervision that it came, so to speak, into full flower. Love, she would say, means more to a flower than all the scientific knowledge in the world. Apparently she felt that the small army of gardeners, each a graduate specialist in duplicating the right planetary conditions, hardly mattered. The collection covered some 200 acres in our grounds at the west side of the house. Small, perhaps, as some of the more vulgar displays by others go, but very, very choice. The other hobby, which she combines with the first, is equally expensive. She and her club members, the Daughters of Terror, DTs for short, often find it necessary to take junkets on the family space yacht out to some distant planet, to straighten out reprehensible conditions which have come to her attention. I usually went along to take care of, symbolically at least, the bags and their baggage. My psychiatrist would say that expressing it in this way shows I have never outgrown my juvenile attitudes. He says I am simply a case of arrested development, mental, caused through too much overshadowing by the rest of the family. He says that, like the rest of them, I have inherited the family compulsion to make the universe over to my own liking, so I can pass it on to posterity with a clear conscience, and my negative attitude toward this is simply a defense mechanism, because I haven't had a chance to do it. He says I really hate my aunt's flora collection because I see it as a rival for her affection. I tell him if I have any resentments towards it at all, it is for the long hours spent in getting the Latinized names of things drilled into me. I ask him why gardeners always insist on forcing long, meaningless names upon non-gardeners who simply don't care. He ignores that and says that subconsciously I hate my Aunt Mattie because I secretly recognize that she is a challenge too great for me to overcome. I ask him why, if I subconsciously hate Aunt Mattie, why I would care about how much affection she gives to her flora collection. He says, "Aha, we are making progress." He says he can't cure me, of what I'm never clear, until I find the means to cut down and destroy my Aunt Mattie. This is all patent nonsense, because Aunt Mattie is the rock, the firm foundation in a universe of shifting values. Even her clichés are precious to me because they are unchanging. On her I can depend. He tells Aunt Mattie his diagnoses and conclusions too. Unethical? Well now, between a mere psychiatrist and my Aunt Mattie, is there any doubt about who shall say what is ethical? After one of their long conferences about me, she calls me into her study, looks at me wordlessly, sadly, shakes her head, sighs, then squares her shoulders until the shelf of her broad, although maiden, bosom becomes huge enough to carry any burden, even the burden of my alleged hate. This she bears bravely, even gratefully. I might resent this needless pain the psychiatrist gives her, except that it really seems to make her happy in some obscure way. Perhaps she has some kind of guilt complex, and I am her deserved punishment. Aunt Mattie with a guilt complex? Never. Aunt Mattie knows she is right, and goes ahead. So all his nonsense is completely ridiculous. I love my Aunt Mattie. I adore my Aunt Mattie. I would never do anything to hurt my Aunt Mattie. Or, well, I didn't mean to hurt her anyway. All I did was wink. I only meant... We were met at the spaceport of Capella 4 by the planet administrator himself, one John J. McCabe. It was no particular coincidence that I knew him. My school was progressive. It admitted not only the scions of the established families, but those of the ambitious families as well. Its graduates, naturally, went into the significant careers. Johnny McCabe was one of the ambitious ones. We hadn't been anything like bosom pals at school, but he'd been tolerant of me, and I'd admired him, and fitfully told myself I should be more like him. Perhaps this was the reason Aunt Mattie had insisted on this particular school, the hope that some of the ambition would rub off on me. Capella 4 wasn't much of a post, not even for the early stages in a young man's career, although socially it was perhaps the best beginning Johnny's family could have expected. It was a small planet, entirely covered by salt. Even inside the port bubble with its duplication of Earth atmosphere, the salt lay like a permanent snow scene. Actually, it was little more than a way station along the space route out in that direction, and Johnny's problems were little more than the problems of a professional host at some obscure resort. But no doubt his dad spoke pridefully of, "My son, a planet administrator," and when I called on the family to tell them I'd visited their son, I wouldn't be one to snitch. There was doubt in my mind that even Johnny's ambition could make the planet into anything more than it was already. It had nothing we wanted, or at least was worth the space freight it would cost to ship it. The natives had never given us any trouble, and up until now we hadn't given them any. So Earth's brand upon it was simply a small bubble enclosing a landing field, a hangar for checkup and repair of ships requiring an emergency landing, some barracks for the men and women of the port personnel, a small hotel to house stranded space passengers while repairs were made to their ship, or stray VIPs. A small administration building flying Federated Earth flag and a warehouse to contain supplies which had to be shipped in completed the installation. The planet furnished man nothing but water pumped from deep in the rock strata beneath the salt, and even that had to be treated to remove enough of the saline content to make it usable. At the time, I didn't know what the natives, outside our bubble, lived on. The decision to come had been a sudden one, and I hadn't had more than enough time to call the State Department to find out who the planet administrator might be. I was first out of the yacht and down the landing steps to the salt-covered ground. Aunt Mattie was still busy giving her ship captain his instructions and possibly inspecting the crew's teeth to see if they had brushed them this morning. The two members of her special committee of the DTs who'd come along, a Miss Point and a Mrs. Waddle, naturally would be standing at her sides and a half-pace to the rear, to be of assistance should she need them in dealing with males. There was a certain stiff formality in the way McCabe, flanked by his own two selected subordinates, approached the ship, until I turned around at the foot of the steps and he recognized me. "Hap!" he yelled then. "Happy Graves, ye old son of a gun!" He broke into a run, dignity forgotten, and when he got to me he grabbed both my shoulders in his powerful hands to shake me as if he were some sort of terrier and I a rat. His joy seemed all out of proportion until I remembered he probably hadn't seen anybody from school for a long time, and until I further remembered that he would have been alerted by the State Department to Aunt Mattie's visit and would have been looking forward to it with dread and misgivings. To realize he had a friend at court must really have overjoyed him. "Johnny," I said. "Long time." It had been. 5-6 years, anyway. I held out my hand in the old-school gesture. He let loose my shoulders and grabbed it in the traditional manner. We went through the ritual, which my psychiatrist would have called juvenile, and then he looked at me pointedly. "You remember what it means," he said, a little anxiously, I thought, and looked significantly at my hand. "That we will always stand by each other, through thick and thin." His eyes were pulled upward to the open door of the yacht. "You can expect it to be both thick and thin," I said dryly, "if you know my Aunt Mattie." "She's your aunt?" he asked, his eyes widening. "Matthew H. Tombs is your aunt? I never knew. To think all those years at school and I never knew. Why, happy old boy. This is wonderful. Man, have I been worried." "Don't stop on my account," I said, maybe a little dolefully. "Somebody reported to the Daughters of Terror that you let the natives run around here stark naked, and if Aunt Mattie says she's going to put Mother Hubbards on them, then that's exactly what she's going to do. You can depend on that, old man." "Mother he gasped. He looked at me strangely. "It's a joke," he said. "Somebody's pulled a practical joke on the DTs. Have you ever seen our natives? Pictures of them? Didn't anyone check up on what they're like before you came out here? It's a joke, a practical joke on the DTs. It has to be." "I wouldn't know," I said. "But if they're naked, they won't be for long, I can tell you that. Aunt Mattie—" His eyes left my face and darted up to the door of the ship, which was no longer a black oval. The unexplained bewilderment of his expression was not diminished as Aunt Mattie came through the door, out on the loading platform, and started down the steps. He grew a little white around the mouth, licked his lips, and forgot all his joy at meeting an old schoolmate. His two subordinates, who had remained standing just out of earshot, as if recognizing a crisis now, stepped briskly up to his sides. Aunt Mattie's two committee women, as if to match phalanx with phalanx, came through the door and started down the steps behind her. I stepped to one side as the two forces met face to face on the crunching salt that covered the ground. It might look like a Christmas scene, but under Capella's rays it was blazing hot, and I found myself in sympathy with the men's open-necked shirts and brief shorts. Still, they should have known better than to dress like that. Somebody in the State Department had goofed. Aunt Mattie and her two committee women were dressed conservatively in something that might have resembled an English colonel's wife's idea of the correct tweeds to wear on a cold, foggy night. If they were already sweltering beneath these coverings, as I was beginning to in my lighter suit, they were too ladylike to show it. Their acid glance at the men's attire showed what they thought of the informality of dress in which they'd been received, but they were too ladylike to comment. After that first pointed look at bare knees, they had no need of it. "This is the official attire prescribed for us by the State Department," Johnny said, a little anxiously, I thought. It was hardly the formal speech of welcome he, as planet administrator, must have prepared. "I have no doubt of it," Aunt Mattie said, and her tone told them what she thought of the State Department under the present administration. "You would hardly have met ladies in such... otherwise." I could see that she was making a mental note to speak to the State Department about it. "Make a note," she said, and turned to Miss Point. "I will speak to the State Department. How can one expect natives to, if our own representatives don't, etc., etc." "May I show you to your quarters, ma'am?" Johnny asked humbly. "No doubt you will wish to freshen up, or—" Miss Point blushed furiously. "We are already quite fresh, young man," Aunt Mattie said firmly. I happened to know that Aunt Mattie didn't like to browbeat people, not at all. It would all have been so much more pleasant, gracious, if they'd been brought up to know right from wrong. But what parents and schools had failed to do, she must correct as her duty. I thought it about time I tried to smooth things over. I stepped up into their focus. "Aunt Mattie," I said, "this is Johnny McCabe. We were at school together." Her eyebrows shot upward. "You were?" she asked, and looked piercingly at Johnny. "Then I realize, young man, that your attire is not your fault. You must have been acting under orders, and against your personal knowledge of what would be correct. I understand." She turned again to Miss Point. "Underscore that note to the State Department," she said. "Mark it emergency." She turned back to Johnny. "Very well, Mr. McCabe. We would appreciate it, after all, if you would show us to our quarters so that we may, freshen up a bit. It is rather a warm day, isn't it?" She was quite gracious now, reassured because Johnny was an old schoolmate of mine and would therefore know right from wrong. If I sometimes didn't seem to, she knew me well enough to know it had not been the fault of the school. The three of us, Johnny on one side of Aunt Mattie and I on the other side, started toward the frame building on the other side of the bubble, which I assumed was the hotel. The four subordinates trailed along behind, silent, wary of one another. Behind them, the baggage truck, which had been piled high by the ship's crew, hissed into life and started moving along on its tractor treads. Johnny caught a glimpse of it, without actually turning round, and his eyes opened wide. He misinterpreted, of course. From the mountain of baggage, it looked like our intention to stay a long time. But then he wouldn't have been particularly reassured either had he realised that our own supplies were quite scant, and these bags, boxes and crates contained sewing machines and many, many bolts of gaily coloured cloth. I had hardly more than, freshened up a bit myself in my hotel room when I heard a discreet knock on my door. I opened it and saw Johnny McCabe. "May I come in, Hap?" he asked. As if against his will, he glanced quickly down the hall toward the suite where Aunt and her committee had been put. "Sure, Johnny," I said, and opened the door wide. I pointed to an aluminium tube torture rack, government issue's idea of a chair. "You can have the chair," I said. "I'll sit on the edge of the bed." "I'm sorry about the furnishings," he said apologetically as he sat down, and I closed the door. "It's the best government will issue us in this hole." "Aunt Mattie would be disappointed if it were better," I said as I sat on the edge of the bed, which was little softer than the chair. "She expects to rough it, and finds special virtue in doing her duty as uncomfortably as possible." He looked sharply at me, but I had merely stated an accepted fact, not an opinion, and was therefore emotionless about it. "I'm in trouble, Hap," he said desperately. He leaned forward with his clasped hands held between his knees. "Well, old man," I answered, "you know me." "Yes," he said, "but there isn't anybody else I can turn to." "Then we understand each other," I agreed. He looked both resentful and puzzled. "No, I never did understand you," he disagreed. "I suppose it's all those billions that act as shock insulation for you. You never had to plan and scheme and stand alert indefinitely like a terrier at a rat hole waiting for opportunity to stick out its nose so you could pounce on it. So I don't see how you can appreciate my problem now." "I might try," I said humbly. "This job," he said, "it's not much and I know it, but it was a start. The department doesn't expect anything from me but patience. It's not so much ability, just a matter of who can hang on the longest without getting into trouble. I've been hanging on and keeping out of trouble." "But you're in trouble now." "I will be when your aunt fails to put Mother Hubbards on the natives." "She won't fail," I said confidently. "And when she storms into the State Department with fire in her eye and starts turning things upside down, it will be my fault somehow," he said miserably. "So let her put some clothes on some natives," I said. "She'll go away happy, and then for all you care, they can take 'em off and burn 'em if they insist on going around naked. Just swing with the punch, man. Don't stand up and let 'em knock your block off. Surely you have some influence with the natives. I don't hear any war drums, any tom-toms. I don't see them trying to tear holes in the side of your bubble to let the air out. You must be at peace with them. You must have some kind of mutual cooperation, so just get a tribe or so to go along with the idea for a while." He looked at me and shook his head sadly. Sort of the way Aunt Mattie shook her head after a conference with my psychiatrist. But Johnny didn't seem somehow happier. He had a pretty good chest, but it didn't look enormous enough to carry any burden. "I've been pretty proud of myself," he said. "After 5 years of daily attempts, and after using everything I ever learned in school courses on extraterrestrial psychology, plus some things I've made up myself, I established a kind of communication with the natives, if you could call it communication. I'd go out in my spacesuit into their chlorinated atmosphere, I'd stand in front of one of them and talk a blue streak, think a blue streak. After about 5 years of it, one of them slowly closed his eye and then opened it again. I invited one of them to come inside the bubble. I told him about the difference in atmosphere, that it might be dangerous. I got one of them to come in. It made no difference to him." "Well, fine then," I said. "Just get some of them to come in again, let Aunt Mattie put some clothes on them, and everybody's happy." He stood up suddenly. "Take a walk with me, Hap," he said. It was more of a command than an invitation. "Over to the edge of the bubble. I want to show you some natives." I was willing. On the way around to the back of the building, over the crunching salt, I had a thought. "If all he did was close an eye," I said, "how did you learn their language so you could invite him inside, explain about the atmosphere?" "I don't even know they have a language," he said. "Maybe he learned mine. I used to draw pictures in the salt, the way they taught us at school, and say words. Maybe it took him 5 years to put the thoughts together. Maybe they don't have any concept of language at all, or need it. Maybe he was thinking about something else all those 5 years and just got round to noticing me. I don't know, Hap." We came around the edge of an outbuilding, then to an unobstructed view of the bubble edge. Even through dark glasses he cautioned me to wear with a gesture, as he put on another pair for himself, the scene through the clear plastic was blinding white. Scattered here and there on the glistening salt were blobs of black. "Why," I exclaimed, "those are octopi. I suppose that's what the natives use for food. I've wondered." "Those are the natives," he answered dryly. By now we were up to the plastic barrier of our bubble and stood looking out at the scene. "Well," I said after some long moments of staring, "it will be a challenge to the DTs, won't it?" He looked at me with disgust. "What do they eat?" I asked. "Salt?" I don't know if they eat, he said. Can't you get it through your thick skull, man, that these things are alien, completely alien? How do I know? Well, you must know some things after 5 years of study. You must have observed them. They must get food somehow. They must sleep and wake. They must procreate. You must have observed something. I've observed the process of procreation, he answered cautiously. Well, fine then, I said. That's what's going to concern Aunt Mattie the most. Here's something that may help you understand them, he said, and I felt a bit of the sardonic in his voice, a grimness. When that one visited me inside here, he said, I took him into my office so I could photograph him better with all the equipment. I was explaining everything, not knowing how much he understood. I happened to pick up a cigarette and a lighter. Soon as I flipped the lighter on, he shot up a tentacle and took it out of my hand. I let him keep it, of course. Next day, when I went outside, every one of them, as far as I could see in the distance, had a lighter exactly like the one I'd given him. Furthermore, in a chlorinated atmosphere, without oxygen, those lighters burned normally. Does that help you to understand them better? He asked, with no attempt to hide the heavy irony. I didn't have a chance to answer because we both heard a crunching in the salt behind us. We turned about and there was Aunt Mattie and her 2 committee women behind her, also now in dark glasses. I waited until the ladies had come up to us, then I waved my arm grandly at the scene beyond the plastic. Behold the natives in all their nakedness, Aunt Mattie, I said. Then to soften the blow it must have been, I'm afraid somebody was pulling your leg when they reported it to the DTs. Miss Point gasped audibly. Miss Waddle said, Shocking! I couldn't tell whether it was the sight of the natives or my remark which indicated I knew they had legs to pull. For the first time in my life I saw uncertainty in Aunt Mattie's eyes as she looked startled at me and then at Johnny. Then her chin squared, her back straightened still more, the shelf of her bosom firmed. It really won't be too much of a problem, girls, she said. Actually simpler than some we've solved. Take a square of cloth, cut a hole in the centre for that head-like pouch to come through where its eye is, put in a drawstring to cinch it up tight above those protuberances, and let it flow over those, legs. Simple and quite attractive, don't you think? The girls nodded happily, and Johnny just stood there gasping for breath. It was simpler than any of us had thought. Johnny looked at me desperately when Aunt Mattie told him to have one of the natives come in so she could fit a pattern on it, to see if any gussets would be needed for fullness, whatever gussets might be. One of them came inside before, I said in answer to Johnny's pleading look. Ask him again. If he refuses, Mohammed will go to the mountain. I'm sure you have extra spacesuits. I'm sure the ladies won't mind going out to the natives if the natives won't come to them. I don't know, Johnny said miserably. He may have had sufficient curiosity to come inside once, but not sufficient to bring him in again. You see, ladies, he turned to them desperately, they don't seem to care about us, one way or the other. The 2 committee women looked apprehensively at Aunt Mattie. Not to care about her, one way or the other? This was beyond comprehension. But Aunt Mattie was equal to it. Very well, she said crisply. We shall not ask them to come to us. We shall go to them. It is our duty to carry enlightenment to the ignorant, wherever they may be, so that they can be taught to care. In the performance of our duty, we have no room for pride. We shall go to them, humbly, happily. We did, too. By the time we'd got into the spacesuits and through the bubble lockout into the ordinary landscape of Capella 4, Capella, the sun, was sinking rapidly. We will just have time, Aunt Mattie said crisply, through the intercom of our suits, to set the pattern and get some idea of the sizes needed. Then tomorrow we can begin our work. Through his faceplate I got a look at Johnny's wide, apprehensive eyes. Ladies, he said desperately, I must warn you again. I've never tried to touch one of them. I don't know what will happen. I can't be held responsible. You have been most remiss, young man, Aunt Mattie said sternly. But then, she added as if remembering that he had gone to a proper school, you're young. No doubt overburdened by nonsensical red tape in your administrative duties. And if you had done this already, there'd be no reason for my being here. I'm always willing to help wherever I'm needed. All 5 of us marched silently and bravely on after that. 100 yards brought us to the first native. It lay there, spread-eagled in 8 directions on the salt. In the centre of the tentacles there arose a column of black rubbery flesh, topped by a rounded dome, in the centre of which was one huge liquid black eye. There was not a twitch of a tentacle as we came to a halt beside it. Is this the one you talked to, Johnny? I asked. How should I know? He asked bitterly. I never knew if I talked to the same one twice. They're much bigger than I thought, Miss Point said with a little dismay in her voice. Some of them are 10 feet in diameter, Johnny said, I thought, with a bit of vindictiveness in his tone. Never mind, Aunt Mattie said. We'll simply sew 3 lengths of cloth together to get our square. I'm sure they won't mind a neatly done seam. She had a length of cloth in one arm of her spacesuit and a pair of scissors in the mechanical claw of the other hand. With her eye, she seemed to measure the diameter of the dome, and manipulating the scissors with the claw like an expert space mechanic, she cut a sizable hole in the center of the cloth. Entirely without fear or hesitation, she stepped into the triangle between two long black tentacles that lay on the salt and walked up to the erect column at the center. Expertly, she flipped the cloth so that the hole settled over the creature's head, or whatever it was. Fore and aft, the cloth rippled out to cover the tentacles. The creature did not move. With an amazing speed, she took some bundles of cloth from the arms of Mrs. Waddle, and with even more amazing dexterity of the space claw, which showed she was no amateur, she basted a length of cloth on either side of the first strip. Then with her scissors, careful not to gouge his hide, she cut off the corners so that the 8 tentacles barely peeped out from underneath the cloth. Somehow it reminded me of a huge red flower with a black pistil laying there on the white salt. "There, sir," my aunt said with satisfaction to the monster. "This will hide your nakedness, instill in you a sense of true modesty." She turned to Johnny. "They must not only know what," she instructed, "they must also know why." She turned back and faced the monster again. "It is not your fault," she said to it, "that you have been living in a state of sin. On Earth, where I come from, we have a code which must be followed. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I'm sure that if I lived in a state of ignorant sin, I would humbly appreciate the kindness of someone letting me know. I'm sure that in time you will also come to appreciate it." It was quite a noble speech, and her 2 companions bowed their spacesuit helmets in acknowledgement. Johnny's mouth and eyes were wide and desperate. She stepped back then, and we all stood there looking at the monster. The dome of its head began to tilt until the eye was fastened upon us. It swept over the 3 ladies, hesitated on Johnny as if recognizing him, but came to rest upon me. It stared at me for a full minute. I stared back. In some strange way, I felt as if my psychiatrist was staring at me, as he often did. Then the great eye slowly closed and opened again. As slowly, and somewhat to my amazement, I felt one of my eyes close and open. I winked at it. "That's all for this evening," Aunt Mattie said crisply. "Let it have its clothes. Get used to them. I have the pattern in my mind. Tomorrow we will get out our sewing machines and really get busy, girls." All the way back to the entrance of the bubble, I felt that huge eye upon me, following me. Why me? The girls did not need to get busy the next morning. I was awakened by a shout. There was the sound of running feet in the hall and a pounding on my door. Sleepy-eyed, for I had dreamed of the monster's eye all night long, I opened the door as soon as I had found a robe to cover my own nakedness. It was Johnny, of course. "Most amazing thing," he rushed in and collapsed into a sitting position on the side of my bed. "Absolutely amazing. You should see them." "What?" I asked. The rumpus must have disturbed the ladies too, for there came another knock on my door, and when I opened it, all 3 of them stood there fully dressed. Apparently they had arisen at the crack of dawn to get busy with their sewing. Miss Point and Mrs. Waddle averted their eyes modestly from the V-neck of my robe and my bare legs. Aunt Mattie was used to my shameless ways. "What is it?" Aunt Mattie asked crisply. Johnny leaped to his feet again. "Amazing," he said again. "I'll have to show you. You'll never believe it." "Young man," Aunt Mattie said sharply, "no one has accused you of untruthfulness, and you are hardly a judge of what we are capable of believing." He stood looking at her with his mouth open. "Now, ladies," I said, and started closing the door, "if you'll excuse me for 2 minutes, I'll dress, and we'll go see what Mr. McCabe wants to show us." The door clicked on my last words, and I hastily doffed the robe and slid into pants and a shirt. Oddly enough, I knew what he was going to show us. I just knew. I slipped on some shoes without bothering about socks. "All right," I said. "I'm ready." They had started down the hall, and we quickly overtook them. Johnny went ahead, led us out of the hotel around its side, and when we came around the corner of the outbuilding which obscured the view, there before us through the bubble wall, we saw what I had expected. As far as the eye could see, dotted here and there like poppies on snow, the natives lay in the early sun, each dressed in flaring cloth like that Aunt Mattie had designed the night before. "You see?" Johnny cried out. "It's the same as with the lighter. One liked it, so they all have it." By now we were up against the plastic barrier. The 2 subordinates were gasping such words as fantastic, amazing, astounding, incredible, wondrous, weird. Aunt Mattie took it all in, and her face lit into a beatific smile. "You see, young man," she said to Johnny, "they needed only to be shown right from wrong. Let this be a lesson to you." "But how did they do it?" Mrs. Waddle gasped. "Give them some credit for diligence and ingenuity," Aunt Mattie almost snapped at her assistant. I always say we underrate the intelligence and ingenuity of the lesser orders, and that it saps their strengths if we are overprotective. I admire self-reliance, and these have shown that they have it, so we will not have to do the sewing after all. Come, girls, we must pack and be on our way back to Earth. Our mission here is accomplished. The two ladies obeyed their leader without question. The three of them, in their sturdy walking shoes and their tweed suits, crunched off across the salt back to their rooms to start packing. Johnny and I walked along more slowly behind. "The incredible Mathua H. Toombs," he breathed. "She's a legend, you know, Hap, but I never believed it before." Then, in a complete and sudden change of mood, he snickered. Or at least it was the nearest thing to a small boy snicker I'd heard since prep school. The snicker turned into a roar of laughter, a grown man's laughter. "If only they knew," he shouted, apparently feeling secure because they'd turned the corner and gone out of sight. "Knew what?" I asked. "Why," he said, and doubled up with laughter again. "They've covered up all the innocent parts and left the reprehensible part, which is right behind the eye, fully exposed." "Johnny, my boy," I said with a chuckle, "do you really believe there are innocent parts and reprehensible parts of any creature in the universe?" He stood stock still and stared at me. "It takes a nasty, salacious mind to make that kind of separation," I said. "But your aunt, the daughters of—" "I know my aunt and the daughters of terror," I said. "I've lived with them for years. I know their kind of mind. Who would know it better? But you, the human race," I said, "is very young. It's only in the last few thousand years that it has discovered sex as a concept. So like little kids in kindergarten, it goes around being embarrassed and snickering. But we'll grow up. Give us time." "But you," he said again. "But they. That's the kind of organisation that keeps us from growing up, Hap. Don't you see that? They've kept us mentally retarded for generations, centuries. How can we make progress when— What's the hurry, Johnny? We've got millions of years, billions, eternity." He looked at me again sharply, shrewdly. "I've underestimated you, Hap," he said. "I'm afraid I always did. I had no idea you—" I shrugged and passed it off. I'd had no idea either, not until this morning, last night, yesterday evening, when that eye had turned on me and I'd winked back. I didn't know how to tell him, or any reason why I should, that there couldn't be anything right or wrong, good or bad, that nothing could happen, nothing at all, excepting through the working of the law of nature. Could one say that water running downhill is good and water being pumped uphill is bad? Both are operating within known physical laws. With millions of years to go, wasn't it likely we would go on discovering the laws governing how things worked? Until one by one we had to give up all notion of good and bad happenings, understood them as only the operation of natural law. In all the universe, how could there be any such thing as unnatural happenings? "Don't worry about it, Johnny," I said as we started walking again. "And don't worry about your career, either. Aunt Mattie likes you, and she's mighty pleased with the results of her work out here. Certain people in the State Department may consider her a bit of a meddlesome pest, but make no mistake about it, every politician in the universe trembles in his boots at the very mention of the DTs. And she likes you, Johnny." "Thanks, Hap," he said as we came to a stop before the doorway of the hotel. "I'll see you before your ship takes off. Oh, you won't tell her she covered up the wrong— well, what she would think was the wrong part?" "I could have told her that last night," I said. He walked away with that startled, incredulous look he'd worn ever since our arrival. On Earth, Aunt Mattie had to rush off to a convention of DTs, where I had no doubt her latest exploit in combating ignorance and sin would be the main topic of conversation and add to the triumph of her lionization. To give her credit, I think this lionization bothered her, embarrassed her a little, and she probably wondered at times if it were all sincere. But I also think she would have been lonely and disappointed without it. When one is doing all he can to make the universe we have inherited a better place for our posterity to inherit, one likes it to be appreciated. For 2 or 3 weeks after she came back home, she was immersed in administrative duties for the DT, setting wheels in motion to carry out all the promises she'd made at the convention. I spent the time in my own suite in the south wing of our house. Mostly I just sat. No one bothered me except the servants necessary to eating, dressing, sleeping, and they were all but mute about it. My psychiatrist called once, but I sent word that I didn't need any today. I called none of my regular friends and did not answer their messages. I did send to the Library of Science in Washington for the original science survey report on Capella 4. It told me little, but allowed me to surmise some things. Apparently the original scientists were singularly uncurious about the octopoids, perhaps because they didn't have 5 years to hang around and wait for one to blink an eye, as Johnny had. As always, they were overworked and understaffed. They did their quick survey and rushed on to some new planet job. If one hoped that someday somebody might go back and take another look at the octopoids, I found no burning yearning for it in the dry reports. As far as they went, their surmise was accurate. Some millions, many millions of years ago, the planet had lost the last of its ocean water. Apparently, as they failed to adapt to the increasing salinity of the little left, one by one the original life forms died out. Something in the octopoid metabolism, or mentality, allowed them to survive, to become land instead of water animals. Something in their metabolism, or mentality, allowed them to subsist on the air and sunlight. Really now, did they even need these? That was as far as the reports went. They did not draw the picture of highly developed mentalities who lay there for millions of years and thought about the nature of being. Such things as how mental manipulation of force fields can provide each of them with a cigarette lighter that burns without any fluid in it and any oxygen around its wick, or such things as Mother Hubbards which had caught their fancy, or perhaps gave them some kind of sensual kick caused by heat filtering through red cloth. But mostly, I just sat. I went to see Aunt Mattie when she came back from the convention, of course. She had the west wing where her sitting room looked out upon her flora collection and the gardeners who were supposed to keep busy. Our greeting was fond but brief. She did look at me rather quizzically, rather shrewdly, but she made no comment. She did not return my visit. This was not unusual. She never visited my suite. When I was 21, she took me into the south wing and said, "Choose your own suite, Hapland. You are a man now, and I understand about young men." If she had in mind what I thought she had, it was a mighty big concession to reality, although of course she was 5 years late in coming around to it. This older generation, so wise, so naive. She probably resolutely refrained from imagining far worse things than really went on. About 2 weeks after she'd come back from the convention, a month since we returned from Capella 4, there was an interruption, an excited one. For once in his life the butler forgot to touch my door with feather fingertips and coughed discreetly. Instead, he knocked 2 sharp raps and opened the door without invitation. "Come quickly, Master Hapland," he chittered urgently. "There are creatures on our private landing field." There were, too. When I got there in my garden scooter and pushed my way through the crowd of gardeners who were clustered on the path and around the gate to the landing field, I saw them. At least a dozen of the Capella 4 octopoids were spread-eagled, their tentacles out flat on the hot cement of the runway. Their eyes stared unblinking into the sun. Over the spread of tentacles, like inverted hibiscus blossoms, they wore their Mother Hubbards. Behind them, over at the far edge of the field, was an exact duplicate of our own space yacht. I wondered, rather hysterically perhaps, if each of them on Capella 4 now had one. I suspected the yacht was simply there for show, that they hadn't needed it, not any more than they needed the Mother Hubbards. There was the hiss of another scooter, and I turned around to see Aunt Mattie come to a stop. She stepped out and came over to me. "Our social call on Capella 4 is being returned," I said with a grin and twinkle at her. She took in the sight with only one blink. "Very well," she answered. "I shall receive them, of course." Somebody once said that the most snobbish thing about the whole tribe of tombs was that they'd never learned the meaning of the word, or had to. But I did wonder what the servants would think when the creatures started slithering into our drawing room. There was a gasp and a low rumble of protesting voices from the gardeners as Aunt Mattie opened the gate and walked through it. I followed, of course. We walked up to the nearest monster and came to stop at the edge of its skirt. "I'm deeply honoured," Aunt Mattie said, with more cordiality than I'd seen her use on a Secretary of State. "What can I do to make your visit to Earth more comfortable?" There was no reply, not even the flicker of a tentacle. They were even more unusual than one might expect. Aunt Mattie resolutely went to each of the dozen and gave the same greeting. She felt her duty as a hostess required it, although I knew that a greeting to one was a greeting to all. Not one of them responded. It seemed rather ridiculous. They'd come all this way to see us, then didn't bother to acknowledge that we were there. We spent more than an hour waiting for some kind of a response. None came. Aunt Mattie showed no sign of impatience, which I thought was rather praiseworthy, all things considered. But finally we left. She didn't show what she felt, perhaps felt only that one had to be patient with the lack of manners in the lower orders. I was more interested in another kind of feeling, the one we left behind. What was it? I couldn't put my finger on it. Sadness, regret, distaste, pity, magnanimity? Give a basket of goodies to the poor at Christmas? Give them some clothes to cover their nakedness? Teach them a sense of shame? No, I couldn't put my finger on it. Hilarity? I found myself regretting that back there on Capella 4, when Aunt Mattie put clothes on him and the monster had looked at me, I winked. I wondered why I should regret that. I didn't have long to wonder. Nothing happened during the rest of the day. We went back, together and separately, several times during the daylight hours and during the early hours of the night. For a wonder, nobody had leaked anything to the newspapers, and for what it was worth, we had the show to ourselves. "Perhaps tomorrow," Aunt Mattie said around midnight as we left the field for the last time. "Perhaps they must rest." "I could use some of that," I said with a yawn. "Yes, Hapland," she agreed. "We must conserve our strength. Heaven knows what may be required of us on the morrow." Did she feel something too? It was so strong, how could she help it? And yet the monster had not looked into her eye. I didn't expect to sleep well, but I fooled myself. I was quite sure I hadn't more than closed my eyes when I was roused by another excited rapping on my bedroom door, and again the butler rushed in without ceremony. "Look, Master Hapland!" he shouted in a near falsetto. He pulled so hard on my drapes they swept back from my windows like a stage curtain, and I looked. To the very limit of our grounds in the distance, but not beyond, the trees, the shrubs, the drives and walkways, the lawns and ponds, all were covered with a 2-foot thick blanket of glistening salt. "And the monsters are gone," the butler was saying, "and I must go to your aunt." "So must I," said, and grabbed up a robe. As I ran, overtook him, past him, from all over the house I could hear excited outcries, wonder, amazement, anger, fear from the servants. I finished the length of my wing, sprinted through the main body of the house, and down the hallway of her wing to the door of her suite. I didn't need to knock, someone had left it open. Her own personal maid, I saw, as I ran past the little alcove into the sitting room. The maid was standing beside Aunt Mattie, wringing her hands and crying. The drapes here too were swept full back, and through the windows I could see the collection, the highly prized, wondrous collection of flora, all covered in salt. Aunt Mattie stood there, without support, looking at it. When I came up to her, there were tears in her eyes and glistening streaks on her wrinkled cheeks. "Why?" she asked. It was very quietly spoken. By now the butler had made the trip and came into the room. I turned to him. "If we hurry," I said, "a good deal of the collection is enclosed under plastic domes. If we don't wet the salt, and if we hurry and have it scraped away from the buildings, it won't poison the ground inside them. We can save most of the collection that way." "No, Master Hapland," he said, and shook his head. "The salt is inside the buildings just as much as here. A gardener shouted it at me as I passed." Aunt Mattie's closed fist came up to her lips and then dropped again. That was all. "Why, Hapland?" she asked again. "Evil for good. Why?" I motioned the maid and butler to leave, and take with them the cluster of servants around the door in the hall. I took Aunt Mattie over to her favourite chair, the one where she could sit and look out at her collection. No point in pretending the salt wasn't there. I sat down at her feet, the way I used to when I was 10 years old. I looked out at the salt, too. It was everywhere. Every inch of our grounds was covered with it, to poison the earth so that nothing could grow in it. It would take years to restore the grounds, and many more years to restore the collection. "Try to understand, Aunt Mattie," I said, "not only what I say, but all the implications of it. They didn't return evil for good. Let's see it from what might have been their point of view. They live in a world of salt, an antiseptic world. We went there, and you intended good. You told them that our code was to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. They returned our visit, and what did they find? What kind of a pestilent horror did we live in? Bare ground, teeming with life, billions of life forms in every cubic foot of ground beneath our feet. Above the ground, too. Raw, growing life all around us, towering over us. If they were doomed to live in such a world, they would want it covered in salt to kill all the life, make it antiseptic. They owed nothing to the rest of earth, but they owed this kindness to you. They did unto others as they would have others do unto them." "I never realized. I was sure I couldn't be. I've built my life around it," she said. "I know," I said with a regretful sigh. "So many people have. And yet I still wonder if it might not have happened at all if I hadn't winked. I wonder if that pesty psychiatrist has been right all along." A Matter of Order by Fox B. Holden. Narrated by William Skye. Balance is a fundamental law of order. How then can integrity cancel such a principle, even though the future of mankind demands it? "I don't like it at all," the tall, thin man said. His name was Tharn, and he was known throughout the sprawling colony for the high-strung nervousness that was understandable enough in a youth of 50, but hardly normal for a man of his years. You had to be careful how you talked to Tharn, even if you were Angelo, Dean of Masters himself. "I don't like it," Tharn reiterated with another dramatic sweep of his long bony arm. "1 bit, Angelo. Look at them circling up there." The thin-lined face turned squarely to Angelo's own, and the large, almost protruding black eyes snapped with all the vibrant fire of the fine artistic mind that boiled constantly behind them. Angelo turned his own eyes upward, momentarily following Tharn's still upthrust arm. Although he did not need to look again. It was as the second eldest of the colony said, of course. The slender, stylus-shaped object that reflected the golden midday sunlight in splintering shards against the almost cloudless cobalt of the sky still circled. It would land at the edge of the great colony. Angelo knew this, Tharn knew it, the colony knew it. Angelo turned his old eyes back upon Tharn, and the ghost of a smile plucked at his white-bearded lips. Tharn coloured, suddenly aware of the incongruous picture he presented. Poised with all the drama of a Mark Antony pleading to the populace to sorrow for a Caesar, while rather mundanely bedecked in his paint-spattered working smock. The high colour in his seamed face remained, but he pursued his point as though Angelo had never smiled at all. "They won't be satisfied." Angelo got up from the canvas stool before his easel, and the motion itself was enough to halt Tharn in mid-sentence. There was going to be some sort of action anyway. "Now look," Angelo said slowly. His voice carried the measured deliberation that its rich, deep timbre complemented so harmoniously. "First of all, Tharn, if we begin showing signs of undue alarm, you know what it will do to our younger men and women. They'll be upset for weeks, and we'll have another one of those terrible realist periods." Angelo grimaced with his incredibly bushy eyebrows. "Besides that, if you take a really careful look at that ship, you'd see in a moment that it's certainly of a type none of us have ever seen. We certainly cannot prevent its landing. We certainly do not have the means to present a hostile front when it does. Therefore, we shall go to the dell and greet it. I would estimate," Angelo turned his massive white head slowly for another glance above the low alabaster walls of the mosaic-tiled courtyard, "that they will effect a landing within another 10 minutes or so. If you'll send an apprentice to go fetch Mela, the philosopher, and Gazy, the semanticist, and I think Ojar, the orator, with word to meet us by the lesser amphitheatre there, we can be on our way directly. Oh, and Tharn." Tharn followed the first elder's glance to his paint-smeared smock, coloured once more, and immediately erupted into a volcano of action, as though rounding up a young jackanapes apprentice and locating and donning a suitable street toga were things that could be simultaneously accomplished. He exited, mumbling heatedly between cries of "Boy! Boy!" and Angelo smiled again and prepared his own person for the meeting. He mused that Mela, the philosopher, commented often in his evening wine that to run was never to escape, only to change the pattern of pursuit, and of course you couldn't argue much with Mela. Not and win, but then nobody on St. Catherine very often argued to win. Where was the pleasure in that? There was a great scorched spot in the soft greenness of the gently rolling earth, and it widened like an undammed muddy pool as the thundering cylinder of steel lowered itself on a pillar of flame. They kept a respectable distance, Angelo, Tharn, Mela, Gazy, Ojar, and the several hundred curious and apprehensive of the colony who had followed. Angelo had decided the closest possible spot for waiting, stopped there, and then made no move save to shield his eyes from the terrible glare of the ship's landing jets as it made its cautious descent. As he had predicted, the chosen landing spot was at the extreme northern edge of the dell, near the lesser amphitheatre, and they had all just arrived in time. The ship settled. Its thunder ceased. Masters, students, and apprentices alike unshielded their eyes, and then all were turned in unbroken silence toward Angelo himself. He was Dean. He could deal with this. Angelo hesitated for perhaps a full minute. In that time he ordered the scene in his mind. The ship from space thrust upward toward the heavens like some weapon of challenge, surrounded by the gentle undulations of the low Renoir range to the far west, the rugged ice-capped Alps of Cézanne to the south, and further distant still, the low, wind-tossed and wild Van Gogh plain that stretched endlessly to the east, and finally to the north, the fertile richness of the valleys of Rembrandt, which reached as far as the eye could see. All this and the warmth of the clear atmosphere that embraced it all was seen and felt in that minute, by Angelo and by the rest, as he intended they should. This, the minute seemed to say, is yours. Do not betray it. And then he was walking with the dignified deliberation of his office toward the ship, the pure white of his full toga billowing gently in the soft breezes of the dell. There was a clanging sound. A round section of the ship, near the wide fins of its stern, swung open. Men came through it, started down a series of metal rungs to the ground. As he walked, Angelo counted them. 1, 2, 3. 3 men. 3 men from Earth, of course. And he knew what they wanted. They met halfway, 3 men from Earth in their blue and silver uniforms, their heads close-shaven, their boots polished as though fashioned of metal, and Angelo, inches shorter than they, far greater in girth than they, with his feet in hide sandals and his long white hair falling free to merge with the rolling folds of his single garment. The man in the middle of the uniformed trio spoke, the obvious leader. "This is the colony of artists, planet of St. Catherine." The heavy sound of his voice seemed to balk at the words ever so slightly. "You are their leader?" "I am Angelo, Dean of Masters here," Angelo replied. "I do not lead, but guide instead. I am at your service, gentlemen of Earth." "You seem certain of where we are from." "But of course. Do I not immediately recognize and speak your tongue?" "You would, of course," the leader said, and Angelo did not miss the hint of grudging acknowledgement in the voice as he said it. In face he was little different than the other two, although perhaps a year or two older. But for all practical purposes they were the same. The high foreheads, the too closely spaced blue eyes, the sharp, disciplined features, the lack of any genuine character at all. They were as much of the same bolt of cloth as the uniforms they wore. "Of course," Angelo smiled. "Our memories here on St. Catherine are fortunately long, and our libraries are well filled, and well used. And of course we have been expecting you." "Expecting us?" "Naturally," and again Angelo smiled. "It is a philosophical truth after all. Man is a social creature by nature, and as such must continually seek the company of his own kind. And of course," and there was the hint of a repressed glitter in the old man's eyes, "the people of Earth have always known and have never forgotten where we of St. Catherine were to be found." The leader reddened and seemed on the point of explosive speech, and the muscles of his jaw hardened as he controlled his impulse. Angelo waited. "You are of course correct," he said after a moment's pause, "and it will perhaps be best for all that we understand each other clearly from the beginning. We come to you in some embarrassment. We come to you asking a favour." The last word the leader uttered with a distaste that the best of his self-discipline could not control, and Angelo chuckled inwardly. A favour, was it? Embarrassed, were they? He could quite imagine. "Perhaps," Angelo said, "it would be more comfortable to discuss your mission in my studio. Will you gentlemen follow me, please?" He turned and began walking back to where the others waited, and the 3 men from Earth followed him. At first they balked for the briefest moment, but they followed him. The studio of Angelo, Dean of Masters, was open to the sky like his courtyard, for this was the fair season on St. Catherine in this latitude, and not yet time to draw the transparent tarpaulin skylight across the tops of the studio walls. Angelo had seated himself near the centre of the superbly muralled room, on one of the low, colourful cushions so widely preferred in the colony to the more formal furniture that was still to be found, to some extent, in the shops and homes of the artisans. Artists in their own way, of course, and some practical work had to be put up with to satisfy the more mundane requirements of existence. As long as they took true pride in the beauty of their work, the artisans would always be very welcome members of the colony, as well, to be sure, as necessary. And seated in a semicircle behind Angelo were the other elders, and 2 or 3 advanced students to cater to whatever needs might arise during the conference. There would be no apprentices here. Before Angelo, taking to their cushions rather awkwardly, his beard fortunately was of sufficient luxuriance to cloak the tiny smile of satisfaction at his lips, were the 3 Earthmen, their leader of course in the centre and facing Angelo directly. "We may begin at any time," Angelo said in his most courtly fashion. Those behind him nodded, Tharn for once a little absently because he had become involved in a rather difficult line sketch on the tablet supplied him for note-taking. He didn't approve of these strangers, but there were more important things than interstellar visitors, especially since they were only Earthmen, and Angelo was insisting on taking full charge. He, Tharn, was through arguing. Walking multiplication tables. Pah! Angelo could have them then. "It is possible you are not aware here on St. Catherine," the leader began with the slightest tinge of sarcasm, "that on Earth there is, at present, a rather regrettable difference of thinking on policy." "Another political slaughter, that is," Angelo countered, not too lightly for the obvious allusion to St. Catherine's complete lack of any kind of electrical or electronic communications. "A major war, in other words." The leader flushed slightly. "Well, yes. As a matter of fact, it has gotten somewhat out of control." His teeth were almost clenched as he made the admission, and Angelo easily sensed the pain in the man at having to make it to the artists of St. Catherine, of all people in the universe. Out of control, the leader was continuing, to the point where, in fact, and according to the unimpeachable findings of our actuarial computers, human life on Earth is threatened with complete extinction. The leader hesitated, interpreted the looks in the eyes of the men whom he faced, and found himself not quite able to meet them with his own. But he continued, best to get it said once and for all. We are now, of course, well aware that predictions which were once thought the mere rantings of alarmists, religious and philosophical cranks, were tragically accurate. Both sides are perfectly matched from the technological aspect, of course. The so-called secrets of science cannot be kept secret at all, at least not by men. They exist everywhere in the universe, for any man to seek and to exploit as he sees fit. He paused, at last found the temerity to meet the gazes of the others. Go on, Angelo said. Both sides have come to absolute stalemate, but not, regrettably, the kind of stalemate that means cessation of activity. In a conflict to the death, stalemate simply means battle without victory, battle until neither side has a living man left to fight. So in short, we are desperate. There must be a victor, or Earth is lost entirely. One more mass strato attack with L-bombs and... Well, at any rate, there must, as you can readily understand, be a victor, and soon. Obviously, the others must be defeated. Yes, of course, thought Mailer the philosopher. It is the others always who must be defeated. And so we have, the leader was saying, come to you for help. He stopped speaking then for a moment, waiting for Angelo's reply. Waiting simply for him to ask, what kind of help could we artists possibly give you? Waiting for and prepared to take unflinchingly the searing taunt that could not help but be in the question. You who can fly ships through space, who have at your computer tips the hard-won miracles of science and engineering? But wordlessly the leader waited. And in the brief moment before he spoke, the history of it all flashed through Angelo's mind. The history that began with the revolt. 3 centuries ago, with the ancestors of them all on St. Catherine. The artists, the philosophers, the writers, the orators, the dramatists, the poets, all of them who had, when at last they could no longer stomach their civilization's arrested adolescence and its refusal to be weaned from its electronic and atomic toys, remembered the first fundamental law of order in art and put it to devastating use. Unity. In unity, they rebelled. They warned first in fairness. They took pains to point out carefully that it is a healthy sign for the developing child to become intrigued with movement, sound, and colour, that it was normal for a child to spend hours observing, examining, operating, even building a new mechanical toy. But when his new books gathered dust and fell into disuse, when he could quote all of Faraday and none of Swinburne, when this happened, his development as a human being of full depth and breadth was at an end. When he became hypnotized by his toys. When motion and force became an obsession. When the means became an end in itself. When the tool became the raison d'etre rather than the structure it had been fashioned only to help build, then the point of civilization had been hopelessly lost, and thinking men had but one alternative: leave and start over. And so, banded together, they had left. It had not been so difficult, for to the ancestors a tool was always that and nothing more. They could not build spaceships, but they could buy them, and so they had. They could not navigate space nor pilot their craft, so they hired the technicians and engineers who could. And when the ancestors had arrived at a planet of their choice, the scientists had been duly proud of their superior accomplishment in being able to find just such a planet, and of course were paid more than the engineers and technicians. The ancestors gave them all sizable bonuses and sent them packing back to Earth where there were so many fine things to spend their money on. The ancestors had, of course, been called dreamers, ivory towerists, alarmists, fools. They had been called madmen who lived in the unenlightened past, believers in some foolishness called artistic integrity, schizoids who were afraid to face reality. Posh, polish, and good riddance, muttered the sane ones over their charts and oscilloscopes as the last of the ancestors' ships blasted free of Earth. Muttered, of course, because there was somehow a vague awareness that the culture vultures hadn't left in fear of the bright, quick machines, but in, well, they said, in disgust. Good riddance to childish rubbish. But now, apparently, the men of Earth had gotten themselves into something so peculiarly impossible that they were desperate enough to face the cutting wit of the fat-bottomed artists on St. Catherine, who wouldn't be able to say, "I told you so," in a straightforward, matter-of-fact way and let it go at that. Oh no. But it would be better to have their damned articulate tongues tear you apart than an S-field. The moment of reflection was spent, and Angelo asked the question. "And how can we help you?" was all he said. The leader took a deep breath. "One moment," Angelo said as he was about to speak. "Just a word of warning, if you please. If you want anything of us at all, simply state your case in plain language. Don't try to sell us anything. We can beat you roundly at that. And if we agree to your request, you will accept exactly what we give you. Beggars, no matter how expert in some things, are still not in the position of choosers. A matter, after all, of, shall we say, artistic integrity?" The leader's eyes flashed. Damn you and your infernal artistic integrity. But it was his mouth which, fortunately for him under the circumstances, did the talking. "Very well. As I said, both sides are in perfect technological and therefore military balance." "Balance is so important," interrupted Angelo. Behind him, Ojar the orator was having a difficult time repressing a yelp of pure mirth. It was unfair, of course, to bait these stumble-witted fellows like this, but it was amusing, especially when Angelo did it, who, though a painter, was well up on his wordplay. "Perhaps you have already noticed," Angelo was going on, quite oblivious to the perspiration on the leader's high forehead, and exactly as Ojar had expected, "how well we of St. Catherine observe the fundamental laws of order, the rhythm of our very way of life, for example. But excuse me, you are outlining your request." The leader had reddened helplessly, and his subordinates had both stolen quick glances at him. It was as though images of the man himself, reflected from mirrors at either side, had suddenly taken on a volition of movement of their own. But quite quickly they became well-behaved images again. "Both sides have equally effective weapons and defences," the leader went on, "and so it has become a disastrous war of attrition. To win, we must have something they do not have, obviously." "To bring your side into dominance, of course," said Angelo sagely. "To prevent your subordination, as it were." Ojar had a sudden violent fit of coughing. "Yes," the leader said. There was a momentary blankness in his eyes, and Angelo decided that enough was enough. Unfairness was unfairness, after all. They must hear the man out. "We have looked back over history," the leader said. "It was an unprecedented step, to be sure, but we were desperate. At any rate, we discovered that one time it was possible to make an enemy believe he was wrong, and that you, his enemy, were right, through a rather obscure verbal art called, I believe it was, propaganda." "Yes," said Angelo. "The province in art of writers and orators. As a painter or sculptor will create illusion with paints or stone, just so did the writer create illusion with letters." "So we came to understand," the leader said, trying a little note of sarcasm of his own. "Our present difficulty is this. We, of course, have no such artists at our disposal. We, of course, tried our own hand at it, but nobody ever seemed quite able to agree on just what it was we were trying to talk about. So, well, we have come to you. Will you do this for us? A few words for the sake of humanity?" Clever, thought Mailer, at that. An intended appeal to the philosophical side of the artistic mind. Maybe the poor wretch really meant it, even if he wasn't aware that humanity meant both sides. "To answer you," Angelo was replying, "I'll of course have to summon our master of letters. It may not be easy to win his assent, I warn you. He can trace his own ancestry all the way back to newspaper reporters, advertising copywriters, and trade journal writers, and so has naturally inherited their bitterness toward all such prostitutions of the art of writing, and artistic integrity in general. And you will admit that hacking out propaganda to order is of course just that, to say nothing of the moral aspects involved. However," magnanimously Angelo lifted his right arm and beckoned, and the student was at once at his side. "Fetch Master Forsyth at once, and tell him I said to leave his new quarto behind. This is urgent." The young woman left, and they waited. "A cigarette?" Angelo proffered the leader. There was surprise on the man's face. "You mean you can make—" "Just crude paper and tobacco grown in the soil," Angelo said apologetically. "Untouched by any rays but the sun's, I'm afraid, and our few medicine men, we have all kinds of hobbies here, of course, just won't comment. Here, and a light." The leader had almost finished his cigarette when the master of letters arrived. "Angelo, you churl, sir! Do you know how long I've been working on that line? You know how difficult it is for me to get a decent crochet when I'm— Oh, company! Capital! Come, fill the cup, and in the fire of spring— Please, Forsyth, these men are here on business. They want you to do them a favour." Resignedly, Forsyth kept quiet, and listened for good measure. He listened for 10 minutes, and then the leader was finished, and Forsyth said, "A pox on it!" "Please, Forsyth." "He's right," came Tharn's voice. "I told you I didn't like it, and I don't, and—" "He doesn't like it!" bellowed Forsyth. "Then by heaven I'll do it!" Teach you, sire, to make charcoal caricatures of me on a day when I'm not lampooning you. Very well, but I don't think I've got too many apprentices that aren't engaged right at the moment. Nonetheless, if... The leader was beyond control. Apprentices, did you say? He croaked hoarsely. Why, what in Dante did you think, man-child? Shot back Forsyth. You don't suppose I'd give you finished creative writers for the job of a trained ape, do you? Some apprentices I've got, and some apprentices you'll get, and only because Dean Angelo here says so. The three men from Earth strode with military precision back to their ship. The leader was in the centre, and his subordinates, each with bulging briefcases in both hands, were on either side. A large group from the colony walked at a slower pace behind. Angelo, as usual, was at their head, and flanking him were Tharn and Forsyth. Another whole week wasted, lamented Forsyth. Not that the time means anything, but those sensitive young boys and girls of mine will never be the same. One of them, just this morning, told me she was thinking of taking up politics as a hobby. The tortures I go through for you, Angelo. I still don't like it, Tharn cut him off. And I don't like them. And Forsyth, I saw what you had your precious little apprentices doing. You had them writing exactly the same tripe they wrote for that other crowd that landed 2 weeks ago. Tharn, you certainly aren't the only one who has no use for that barbaric breed. So, as long as they remain equally matched, they'll eventually, But that means a fundamental law of order, of course, my dear Tharn. Balance, as I think I may already have pointed out. Forsyth quoted something from an obscure source about the importance of artistic integrity, and then they watched together as the ship from Earth blasted homeward. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories and compilations. Thanks. The Skull by Philip K. Dick. Narrated by William Skye. Conger agreed to kill a stranger he had never seen, but he would make no mistakes because he had the stranger's skull under his arm. What is this opportunity? Conger asked. Go on, I'm interested. The room was silent. All faces were fixed on Conger, still in the drab prison uniform. The speaker leaned forward slowly. Before you went to prison, your trading business was paying well. All illegal, all very profitable. Now you have nothing except the prospect of another 6 years in a cell. Conger scowled. There is a certain situation, very important to this council, that requires your peculiar abilities. Also, it is a situation you might find interesting. You were a hunter, were you not? You've done a great deal of trapping, hiding in the bushes, waiting at night for the game. I imagine hunting must be a source of satisfaction to you, the chase, the stalking. Conger sighed. His lips twisted. All right, he said, leave that out. Get to the point. Who do you want me to kill? The speaker smiled. All in proper sequence, he said softly. The car slid to a stop. It was night. There was no light anywhere along the street. Conger looked out. Where are we? What is this place? The hand of the guard pressed into his arm. Come, through that door. Conger stepped down onto the damp sidewalk. The guard came swiftly after him, and then the speaker. Conger took a deep breath of the cold air. He studied the dim outline of the building rising up before them. I know this place. I've seen it before. He squinted, his eyes growing accustomed to the dark. Suddenly he became alert. This is... Yes, the first church. The speaker walked toward the steps. We're expected. Expected? Here? Yes, the speaker mounted the stairs. You know we're not allowed in their churches, especially with guns. He stopped. 2 armed soldiers loomed up ahead, one on each side. All right, the speaker looked up at them. They nodded. The door of the church was open. Conger could see other soldiers inside, standing about, young soldiers with large eyes, gazing at the icons and holy images. I see, he said. It was necessary, the speaker said. As you know, we have been singularly unfortunate in the past in our relations with the First Church. This won't help. But it's worth it, you will see. They passed through the hall and into the main chamber where the altarpiece was and the kneeling places. The speaker scarcely glanced at the altar as they passed by. He pushed open a small side door and beckoned Conger through. In here. We have to hurry. The faithful will be flocking in soon. Conga entered, blinking. They were in a small chamber, low-ceilinged, with dark panels of old wood. There was a smell of ashes and smouldering spices in the room. He sniffed. What's that? The smell? Cups on the wall. I don't know. The speaker crossed impatiently to the far side. According to our information, it is hidden here by this... Conga looked around the room. He saw books and papers, holy signs and images. A strange low shiver went through him. Does my job involve anyone of the church? If it does... The speaker turned astonished. Can it be that you believe in the founder? Is it possible? A hunter? A killer? No, of course not. All their business about resignation to death, non-violence. What is it then? Conga shrugged. I've been taught not to mix with such as these. They have strange abilities, and you can't reason with them. The speaker studied Conga thoughtfully. You have the wrong idea. It is no one here that we have in mind. We found that killing them only tends to increase their numbers. Then why come here? Let's leave. No, we came for something important. Something you will need to identify your man. Without it, you won't be able to find him. A trace of a smile crossed the speaker's face. We don't want you to kill the wrong person. It's too important. I don't make mistakes. Conga's chest rose. Listen, speaker, this is an unusual situation, the speaker said. You see, the person you are after, the person that we are sending you to find, is known only by certain objects here. They are the only traces, the only means of identification. Without them, what are they? He came toward the speaker. The speaker moved to one side. Look, he said. He drew a sliding wall away, showing a dark square hole. In there. Conga squatted down, staring in. He frowned. A skull, a skeleton. The man you are after has been dead for 2 centuries, the speaker said. This is all that remains of him, and this is all you have with which to find him. For a long time Conga said nothing. He stared down at the bones, dimly visible in the recess of the wall. How could a man dead centuries be killed? How could he be stalked, brought down? Conga was a hunter, a man who had lived as he pleased, where he pleased. He had kept himself alive by trading, bringing furs and pelts in from the provinces on his own ship, riding at high speed, slipping through the customs line around Earth. He had hunted in the great mountains of the moon. He had stalked through empty Martian cities. He had explored, the speaker said. Soldier, take these objects and have them carried to the car. Don't lose any part of them. The soldier went into the cupboard, reaching gingerly, squatting on his heels. It is my hope, the speaker continued softly to Conga, that you will demonstrate your loyalty to us now. There are always ways for citizens to restore themselves, to show their devotion to their society. For you, I think this would be a very good chance. I seriously doubt that a better one will come. And for your efforts there will be quite a restitution, of course. The 2 men looked at each other, Conga thin, unkempt, the speaker immaculate in his uniform. I understand you, Conga said. I understand this part, about the chance. But how can a man who has been dead 2 centuries be... I'll explain later, the speaker said. Right now we have to hurry. The soldier had gone out with the bones wrapped in a blanket held carefully in his arms. The speaker walked to the door. Come, they've already discovered that we've broken in here, and they'll be coming at any moment. They hurried down the damp steps to the waiting car. A second later, the driver lifted the car up into the air above the housetops. The speaker settled back in the seat. The first church has an interesting past, he said. I suppose you are familiar with it, but I'd like to speak of a few points that are of relevancy to us. It was in the 20th century that the movement began, during one of the periodic wars. The movement developed rapidly, feeding on the general sense of futility, the realization that each war was breeding greater war, with no end in sight. The movement posed a simple answer to the problem. Without military preparations, weapons, there could be no war. And without machinery and complex scientific technocracy, there could be no weapons. The movement preached that you couldn't stop war by planning for it. They preached that man was losing to his machinery and science, that it was getting away from him, pushing him into greater and greater wars. Down with society, they shouted. Down with factories and science. A few more wars and there wouldn't be much left of the world. The founder was an obscure person from a small town in the American Middle West. We don't even know his name. All we know is that one day he appeared, preaching a doctrine of non-violence, non-resistance, no fighting, no paying taxes for guns, no research except for medicine. Live out your life quietly, tending your garden, staying out of public affairs, mind your own business. Be obscure, unknown, poor. Give away most of your possessions, leave the city. At least that was what developed from what he told the people. The car dropped down and landed on a roof. The founder preached this doctrine, or the germ of it. There's no telling how much the faithful have added themselves. The local authorities picked him up at once, of course. Apparently they were convinced that he meant it. He was never released. He was put to death and his body buried secretly. It seemed that the cult was finished. The speaker smiled. Unfortunately, some of his disciples reported seeing him after the date of his death. The rumour spread. He had conquered death. He was divine. It took hold, grew, and here we are today with the first church obstructing all social progress, destroying society, sowing the seeds of anarchy. But the wars, Conger said. About them? The wars? Well, there were no more wars. It must be acknowledged that the elimination of war was the direct result of non-violence practiced on a general scale. But we can take a more objective view of war today. What was so terrible about it? War had a profound selective value, perfectly in accord with the teachings of Darwin and Mendel and others. Without war, the mass of useless, incompetent mankind, without training or intelligence, is permitted to grow and expand unchecked. War acted to reduce their numbers, like storms and earthquakes and droughts. It was nature's way of eliminating the unfit. Without war, the lower elements of mankind have increased all out of proportion. They threaten the educated few, those with scientific knowledge and training, the ones equipped to direct society. They have no regard for science or a scientific society based on reason. And this movement seeks to aid and abet them. Only when scientists are in full control can the... He looked at his watch and then kicked the car door open. I'll tell you the rest as we walk. They crossed the dark roof. Doubtless you now know whom those bones belong to, who it is that we are after. He has been dead just 2 centuries now, this ignorant man from the Middle West, this founder. The tragedy is that the authorities of the time acted too slowly. They allowed him to speak, to get his message across. He was allowed to preach, to start his cult, and once such a thing is underway, there's no stopping it. But what if he had died before he preached? What if none of his doctrines had ever been spoken? It took only a moment for him to utter them, that we know. They say he spoke just once, just one time. Then the authorities came, taking him away. He offered no resistance. The incident was small. The speaker turned to Conger. Small, but we're reaping the consequences of it today. They went inside the building. Inside, the soldiers had already laid out the skeleton on a table. The soldiers stood around it, their young faces intense. Conger went over to the table, pushing past them. He bent down, staring at the bones. So these are his remains, he murmured. The founder. The church has hidden them for 2 centuries. Quite so, the speaker said, but now we have them. Come along down the hall. They went across the room to a door. The speaker pushed it open. Technicians looked up. Conger saw machinery whirring and turning, benches and retorts. In the centre of the room was a gleaming crystal cage. The speaker handed a Slem gun to Conger. The important thing to remember is that the skull must be saved and brought back, for comparison and proof. Aim low, at the chest. Conger weighed the gun in his hands. It feels good, he said. I know this gun, that is, I've seen them before, but I never used one. The speaker nodded. You will be instructed on the use of the gun and the operation of the cage. You will be given all data we have on the time and location. The exact spot was a place called Hudson's Field, about 1960, in a small community outside Denver, Colorado. And don't forget, the only means of identification you will have will be the skull. There are visible characteristics of the front teeth, especially the left incisor. Conger listened absently. He was watching 2 men in white carefully wrapping the skull in a plastic bag. They tied it and carried it into the crystal cage. And if I should make a mistake? Pick the wrong man? Then find the right one. Don't come back until you succeed in reaching this founder. And you can't wait for him to start speaking, that's what we must avoid. You must act in advance. Take chances, shoot as soon as you think you've found him. He'll be someone unusual, probably a stranger in the area. Apparently he wasn't known. Conga listened dimly. Do you think you have it all now? The speaker asked. Yes, I think so. Conga entered the crystal cage and sat down, placing his hands on the wheel. Good luck, the speaker said. We'll be awaiting the outcome. There's some philosophical doubt as to whether one can alter the past. This should answer the question once and for all. Conga fingered the controls of the cage. By the way, the speaker said, don't try to use this cage for purposes not anticipated in your job. We have a constant trace on it. If we want it back, we can get it back. Good luck. Conga said nothing. The cage was sealed. He raised his finger and touched the wheel control. He turned the wheel carefully. He was still staring at the plastic bag when the room outside vanished. For a long time there was nothing at all. Nothing beyond the crystal mesh of the cage. Thoughts rushed through Conga's mind, helter-skelter. How would he know the man? How could he be certain in advance? What had he looked like? What was his name? How had he acted before he spoke? Would he be an ordinary person, or some strange outlandish crank? Conga picked up the Slem gun and held it against his cheek. The metal of the gun was cool and smooth. He practiced moving the sight. It was a beautiful gun, the kind of gun he could fall in love with. If he had owned such a gun in the Martian desert, on the long nights when he had lain cramped and numbed with cold, waiting for things that moved through the darkness. He put the gun down and adjusted the meter readings of the cage. The spiraling mist was beginning to condense and settle. All at once forms wavered and fluttered around him. Colours, sounds, movements filtered through the crystal wire. He clamped the controls off and stood up. He was on a ridge overlooking a small town. It was high noon. The air was crisp and bright. A few automobiles moved along a road. Off in the distance were some level fields. Conga went to the door and stepped outside. He sniffed the air, then he went back into the cage. He stood before the mirror over the shelf, examining his features. He had trimmed his beard, they had not got in to cut it off, and his hair was neat. He was dressed in the clothing of the middle 20th century, the odd collar and coat, the shoes of animal hide. In his pocket was money of the times. That was important. Nothing more was needed. Nothing except his ability, his special cunning. But he had never used it in such a way before. He walked down the road toward the town. The first things he noticed were the newspapers on the stands. April 5th, 1961. He was not too far off. He looked around him. There was a filling station, a garage, some taverns and a 10-cent store. Down the street was a grocery store and some public buildings. A few minutes later he mounted the stairs of the little public library and passed through the doors into the warm interior. The librarian looked up, smiling. "Good afternoon," she said. He smiled, not speaking because his words would not be correct, accented and strange probably. He went over to a table and sat down by a heap of magazines. For a moment he glanced through them. Then he was on his feet again. He crossed the room to a wide rack against the wall. His heart began to beat heavily. Newspapers, weeks on end. He took a roll of them over to the table and began to scan them quickly. The print was odd, the letters strange. Some of the words were unfamiliar. He set the papers aside and searched farther. At last he found what he wanted. He carried the Cherrywood Gazette to the table and opened it to the first page. He found what he wanted. Prisoner hangs self. An unidentified man held by the county sheriff's office for suspicion of criminal syndicalism was found dead this morning by... He finished the item. It was vague, uninforming. He needed more. He carried the Gazette back to the racks and then, after a moment's hesitation, approached the librarian. More, he asked. More papers. Old ones? She frowned. How old? Which papers? Months old. And before. Of the Gazette? This is all we have. What did you want? What are you looking for? Maybe I can help you. He was silent. You might find older issues at the Gazette office, the woman said, taking off her glasses. Why don't you try there? But if you tell me, maybe I could help you. He went out. The Gazette office was down a side street. The sidewalk was broken and cracked. He went inside. A heater glowed in the corner of the small office. A heavy-set man stood up and came slowly over to the counter. What did you want, mister? He said. Old papers. A month or more. To buy? You want to buy them? Yes. He held out some of the money he had. The man stared. Sure, he said. Sure, wait a minute. He went quickly out of the room. When he came back, he was staggering under the weight of his armload, his face red. Here are some, he grunted. Took what I could find. Covers the whole year. And if you want more... Conger carried the papers outside. He sat down by the road and began to go through them. What he wanted was 4 months back in December. It was a tiny item, so small that he almost missed it. His hands trembled as he scanned it using the small dictionary for some of the archaic terms. Man arrested for unlicensed demonstration. An unidentified man who refused to give his name was picked up in Cooper Creek by special agent of the sheriff's office, according to Sheriff Duff. It was said the man was recently noticed in this area and had been watched continually. It was Cooper Creek, December 1960. His heart pounded. That was all he needed to know. He stood up, shaking himself, stamping his feet on the cold ground. The sun had moved across the sky to the very edge of the hills. He smiled. Already he had discovered the exact time and place. Now he needed only to go back, perhaps to November, to Cooper Creek. He walked back through the main section of town, past the library, past the grocery store. It would not be hard. The hard part was over. He would go there, rent a room, prepare to wait until the man appeared. He turned the corner. A woman was coming out of a doorway, loaded down with packages. Conger stepped aside to let her pass. The woman glanced at him. Suddenly her face turned white. She stared, her mouth open. Conger hurried on. He looked back. What was wrong with her? The woman was still staring. She had dropped the packages to the ground. He increased his speed. He turned a second corner and went up a side street. When he looked back again, the woman had come to the entrance of the street and was starting after him. A man joined her and the two of them began to run toward him. He lost them and left the town, striding quickly, easily up into the hills at the edge of town. When he reached the cage, he stopped. What had happened? Was it something about his clothing, his dress? He pondered. Then, as the sun set, he stepped into the cage. Conger sat before the wheel. For a moment he waited, his hands resting lightly on the control. Then he turned the wheel just a little, following the control readings carefully. The greyness settled down around him, but not for very long. The man looked him over critically. You better come inside, he said. Out of the cold. Thanks. Conger went gratefully through the open door into the living room. It was warm and close from the heat of the little kerosene heater in the corner. A woman, large and shapeless in her flowered dress, came from the kitchen. She and the man studied him critically. It's a good room, the woman said. I'm Mrs. Appleton. It's got heat. You need that this time of year. Yes, he nodded, looking around. You want to eat with us? What? You want to eat with us? The man's brows knitted. You're not a foreigner, are you, mister? No, he smiled. I was born in this country. Quite far west, though. California? No, he hesitated. In Oregon. What's it like up there? Mrs. Appleton asked. I hear there's a lot of trees and green. It's so barren here. I come from Chicago, myself. That's the Middle West, the man said to her. You ain't no foreigner. Oregon isn't foreign either, Conger said. It's part of the United States. The man nodded absently. He was staring at Conger's clothing. That's a funny suit you got on, mister, he said. Where'd you get that? Conger was lost. He shifted uneasily. It's a good suit, he said. Maybe I'd better go some other place if you don't want me here. They both raised their hands protestingly. The woman smiled at him. We just have to look out for those Reds. You know, the government is always warning us about them. The Reds? He was puzzled. The government says they're all around. We're supposed to report anything strange or unusual, anybody doesn't act normal. Like me? They looked embarrassed. Well, you don't look like a Red to me, the man said, but we have to be careful. The Tribune says... Conger half listened. It was going to be easier than he had thought. Clearly he would know as soon as the founder appeared. These people, so suspicious of anything different, would be buzzing and gossiping and spreading the story. All he had to do was lie low and listen, down at the general store perhaps, or even here in Mrs. Appleton's boarding house. Can I see the room? He said. Certainly. Mrs. Appleton went to the stairs. "I'll be glad to show it to you." They went upstairs. It was colder upstairs, but not nearly as cold as outside, nor as cold as nights on the Martian deserts. For that he was grateful. He was walking slowly around the store, looking at the cans of vegetables, the frozen packages of fish and meat shining and clean in the open refrigerator counters. Ed Davies came toward him. "Can I help you?" he said. The man was a little oddly dressed, and with a beard. Ed couldn't help smiling. "Nothing," the man said in a funny voice. "Just looking." "Sure," Ed said. He walked back behind the counter. Mrs. Hackett was wheeling her cart up. "Who's he?" she whispered, her sharp face turned, her nose moving as if it was sniffing. "I've never seen him before." "I don't know. Looks funny to me. Why does he wear a beard? No one else wears a beard. Must be something the matter with him." "Maybe he likes to wear a beard. I had an uncle who—" "Wait," Mrs. Hackett stiffened. "Didn't what was his name? The red, that old one. Didn't he have a beard? Marx. He had a beard." Ed laughed. "This ain't Karl Marx. I saw a photograph of him once." Mrs. Hackett was staring at him. "You did?" "Sure." He flushed a little. "What's the matter with that?" "I'd sure like to know more about him," Mrs. Hackett said. "I think we ought to know more, for our own good." "Hey, mister, want a ride?" Conger turned quickly, dropping his hand to his belt. He relaxed. 2 young kids in a car, a girl and a boy. He smiled at them. "A ride? Sure." Conger got into the car and closed the door. Bill Willett pushed the gas and the car roared down the highway. "I appreciate a ride," Conger said carefully. "I was taking a walk between towns, but it was farther than I thought." "Where are you from?" Laura Hunt asked. She was pretty, small and dark in her yellow sweater and blue skirt. "From Cooper Creek." "Cooper Creek?" Bill said. He frowned. "That's funny, I don't remember seeing you before." "Why, do you come from there?" "I was born there. I know everybody there." "I just moved in. From Oregon." "From Oregon? I didn't know Oregon people had accents." "Do I have an accent?" "You use words funny." "How?" "I don't know. Doesn't he, Laura?" "You slur them," Laura said, smiling. "Talk some more. I'm interested in dialects." She glanced at him, white teeth. Conger felt his heart constrict. "I have a speech impediment." "Oh," her eyes widened. "I'm sorry." They looked at him curiously as the car purred along. Conger, for his part, was struggling to find some way of asking them questions without seeming curious. "I guess people from out of town don't come here much," he said. "Strangers." "No," Bill shook his head. "Not very much." "I'll bet I'm the first outsider for a long time." "I guess so." Conger hesitated. "A friend of mine, someone I know, might be coming through here. Where do you suppose I might—" He stopped. "Would there be anyone certain to see him? Someone I could ask, make sure I don't miss him if he comes?" They were puzzled. "Just keep your eyes open. Cooper Creek isn't very big." "No, that's right." They drove in silence. Conger studied the outline of the girl. Probably she was the boy's mistress. Perhaps she was his trial wife. Or had they developed trial marriage back so far? He could not remember. But surely such an attractive girl would be someone's mistress by this time. She would be 16 or so by her looks. He might ask her sometime if they ever met again. The next day Conger went walking along the one main street of Cooper Creek. He passed the general store, the 2 filling stations, and then the post office. At the corner was the soda fountain. He stopped. Laura was sitting inside talking to the clerk. She was laughing, rocking back and forth. Conger pushed the door open. Warm air rushed around him. Laura was drinking hot chocolate with whipped cream. She looked up in surprise as he slid into the seat beside her. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Am I intruding?" "No." She shook her head. Her eyes were large and dark. "Not at all." The clerk came over. "What do you want?" Conger looked at the chocolate. "Same as she has." Laura was watching Conger, her arms folded, elbows on the counter. She smiled at him. "By the way, you don't know my name. Laura Hunt." She was holding out her hand. He took it awkwardly, not knowing what to do with it. "Conger is my name," he murmured. "Conger? Is that your last or first name?" Last or first? He hesitated. Last. Omar Conger. Omar? She laughed. That's like the poet, Omar Khayyam. I don't know of him. I know very little of poets. We restored very few works of art. Usually only the church has been interested enough. He broke off. She was staring. He flushed. Where I come from, he finished. The church? Which church do you mean? The church. He was confused. The chocolate came and he began to sip it gratefully. Laura was still watching him. You're an unusual person, she said. Bill didn't like you, but he never likes anything different. He's so prosaic. Don't you think that when a person gets older he should become broadened in his outlook? Conger nodded. He says foreign people ought to stay where they belong, not come here. But you're not so foreign. He means Orientals, you know. Conger nodded. The screen door opened behind them. Bill came into the room. He stared at them. Well, he said. Conger turned. Hello. Well, Bill sat down. Hello, Laura. He was looking at Conger. I didn't expect to see you here. Conger tensed. He could feel the hostility of the boy. Something wrong with that? No, nothing wrong with it. There was silence. Suddenly Bill turned to Laura. Come on, let's go. Go? She was astonished. Why? Just go. He grabbed her hand. Come on, the car's outside. Why, Bill Willett, Laura said. You're jealous. Who is this guy? Bill said. Do you know anything about him? Look at him, his beard. She fled. So what? Just because he doesn't drive a Packard and go to Cooper High? Conger sized the boy up. He was big and strong. Probably he was part of some civil control organization. Sorry, Conger said. I'll go. What's your business in town? Bill asked. What are you doing here? Why are you hanging around Laura? Conger looked at the girl. He shrugged. No reason. I'll see you later. He turned away and froze. Bill had moved. Conger's fingers went to his belt. Half pressure, he whispered to himself. No more. Half pressure. He squeezed. The room leaped around him. He himself was protected by the lining of his clothing, the plastic sheathing inside. My God! Laura put her hands up. Conger cursed. He hadn't meant any of it for her, but it would wear off. There was only a half amp to it. It would tingle. Tingle and paralyze. He walked out the door without looking back. He was almost to the corner when Bill came slowly out, holding onto the wall like a drunken man. Conger went on. As Conger walked, restless in the night, a form loomed in front of him. He stopped, holding his breath. Who is it? A man's voice came. Conger waited, tense. Who is it? The man said again. He clicked something in his hand. A light flashed. Conger moved. It's me, he said. Who is me? Conger is my name. I'm staying at the Appletons' place. Who are you? The man came slowly up to him. He was wearing a leather jacket. There was a gun at his waist. I'm Sheriff Duff. I think you're the person I want to talk to. You were in Bloom's today about 3 o'clock. Bloom's? The fountain, where the kids hang out. Duff came up beside him, shining his light into Conger's face. Conger blinked. Turn that thing away, he said. A pause. All right. The light flickered to the ground. You were there. Some trouble broke out between you and the Willett boy. Is that right? You had a beef over his girl. We had a discussion, Conger said carefully. Then what happened? Why? I'm just curious. They say you did something. Did something? Did what? I don't know. That's what I'm wondering. They saw a flash and something seemed to happen. They all blacked out, couldn't move. How are they now? All right. There was silence. Well, Duff said, what was it? A bomb? A bomb? Conger laughed. No. My cigarette lighter caught fire. There was a leak and the fluid ignited. Why did they all pass out? Fumes. Silence. Conger shifted, waiting. His fingers moved slowly toward his belt. The sheriff glanced down. He grunted. If you say so, he said. Anyhow, there wasn't any real harm done. He stepped back from Conger. And that Willett is a troublemaker. Good night, then, Conger said. He started past the sheriff. One more thing, Mr. Conger, before you go. You don't mind if I look at your identification, do you? No, not at all. Conger reached into his pocket. He held his wallet out. The sheriff took it and shined his flashlight on it. Conger watched, breathing shallowly. They had worked hard on the wallet, studying historic documents, relics of the times, all the papers they felt would be relevant. Duff handed it back. Okay, sorry to bother you. The light winked off. When Conger reached the house, he found the Appletons sitting around the television set. They did not look up as he came in. He lingered at the door. Can I ask you something? He said. Mrs. Appleton turned slowly. Can I ask you, what's the date? The date? She studied him. The 1st of December. December 1st? Why, it was just November. They were all looking at him. Suddenly he remembered. In the 20th century they still used the old 12-month system. November fed directly into December. There was no quartember between. He gasped. Then it was tomorrow. The 2nd of December. Tomorrow. Thanks, he said. Thanks. He went up the stairs. What a fool he was forgetting. The founder had been taken into captivity on the 2nd of December, according to the newspaper records. Tomorrow, only 12 hours hence, the founder would appear to speak to the people and then be dragged away. The day was warm and bright. Conger's shoes crunched the melting crust of snow. On he went, through the trees heavy with white. He climbed a hill and strode down the other side, sliding as he went. He stopped to look around. Everything was silent. There was no one in sight. He brought a thin rod from his waist and turned the handle of it. For a moment nothing happened. Then there was a shimmering in the air. The crystal cage appeared and settled slowly down. Conger sighed. It was good to see it again. After all, it was his only way back. He walked up on the ridge. He looked around with some satisfaction, his hands on his hips. Hudson's Field was spread out all the way to the beginning of town. It was bare and flat, covered with a thin layer of snow. Here the founder would come. Here he would speak to them. And here the authorities would take him. Only he would be dead before they came. He would be dead before he even spoke. Conger returned to the crystal globe. He pushed through the door and stepped inside. He took the Slem gun from the shelf and screwed the bolt into place. It was ready to go, ready to fire. For a moment he considered. Should he have it with him? No. It might be hours before the founder came, and suppose someone approached him in the meantime. When he saw the founder coming toward the field, then he could go and get the gun. Conger looked toward the shelf. There was the neat plastic package. He took it down and unwrapped it. He held the skull in his hands, turning it over. In spite of himself, a cold feeling rushed through him. This was the man's skull, the skull of the founder who was still alive, who would come here this day, who would stand on the field not 50 yards away. What if he could see this, his own skull, yellow and eroded? 2 centuries old. Would he still speak? Would he speak if he could see it, the grinning, aged skull? What would there be for him to say, to tell the people? What message could he bring? What action would not be futile when a man could look upon his own aged yellow skull? Better they should enjoy their temporary lives while they still had them to enjoy. A man who could hold his own skull in his hands would believe in few causes, few movements. Rather, he would preach the opposite. A sound. Conger dropped the skull back on the shelf and took up the gun. Outside something was moving. He went quickly to the door, his heart beating. Was it he? Was it the founder wandering by himself in the cold, looking for a place to speak? Was he meditating over his words, choosing his sentences? What if he could see what Conger had held? He pushed the door open, the gun raised. Laura! He stared at her. She was dressed in a wool jacket and boots, her hands in her pockets. A cloud of steam came from her mouth and nostrils. Her breast was rising and falling. Silently they looked at each other. At last Conger lowered the gun. "What is it?" he said. "What are you doing here?" She pointed. She did not seem able to speak. He frowned. What was wrong with her? "What is it?" he said. "What do you want?" He looked in the direction she had pointed. "I don't see anything." "They're coming." "They? Who? Who are coming?" "They are. The police. During the night the sheriff had the state police send cars. All around, everywhere. Blocking the roads. There's about 60 of them coming. Some from town, some around behind." She stopped, gasping. They said... What? "They said you were some kind of a communist. They said..." Conga went into the cage. He put the gun down on the shelf and came back out. He leaped down and went to the girl. Thanks. You came here to tell me? You don't believe it? I don't know. Did you come alone? No, Joe brought me in his truck, from town. Joe? Who's he? Joe French, the plumber. He's a friend of Dad's. Let's go. They crossed the snow, up the ridge and onto the field. The little panel truck was parked halfway across the field. A heavy, short man was sitting behind the wheel smoking his pipe. He sat up as he saw the two of them coming toward him. Are you the one? He said to Conga. Yes. Thanks for warning me. The plumber shrugged. I don't know anything about this. Laura says you're all right. He turned around. It might interest you to know some more of them are coming. Not to warn you, just curious. More of them? Conga looked toward the town. Black shapes were picking their way across the snow. People from the town. You can't keep this sort of thing quiet, not in a small town. We all listen to the police radio. They heard the same way Laura did. Someone tuned in, spread it around. The shapes were getting closer. Conga could make out a couple of them. Bill Willett was there with some boys from the high school. The Appletons were along, hanging back in the rear. Even Ed Davies, Conga murmured. The storekeeper was toiling onto the field with 3 or 4 other men from the town. All curious as hell, French said. Well, I guess I'm going back to town. I don't want my truck shop full of holes. Come on, Laura. She was looking up at Conga wide-eyed. Come on, French said again. Let's go. You sure as hell can't stay here, you know. Why? There may be shooting. That's what they all came to see. You know that, don't you, Conga? Yes. You have a gun, or don't you care? French smiled a little. They've picked up a lot of people in their time, you know. You won't be lonely. He cared, all right. He had to stay here on the field. He couldn't afford to let them take him away. Any minute the founder would appear, would step onto the field. Would he be one of the townsmen standing silently at the foot of the field, waiting, watching? Or maybe he was Joe French, or maybe one of the cops. Any one of them might find himself moved to speak, and the few words spoken this day were going to be important for a long time. And Conga had to be there, ready when the first word was uttered. I care, he said. You go on back to town. Take the girl with you. Laura got stiffly in beside Joe French. The plumber started up the motor. Look at them. Look at them, standing there, he said. Like vultures, waiting to see someone get killed. The truck drove away, Laura sitting stiff and silent, frightened now. Conga watched for a moment, then he dashed back into the woods between the trees toward the ridge. He could get away, of course. Any time he wanted to, he could get away. All he had to do was leap into the crystal cage and turn the handles. But he had a job, an important job. He had to be here at this place, at this time. He reached the cage and opened the door. He went inside and picked up the gun from the shelf. The Slem gun would take care of them. He notched it up to full count. The chain reaction from it would flatten them all, the police, the curious, sadistic people. They wouldn't take him. Before they got him, all of them would be dead. He would get away. He would escape. By the end of the day, they would all be dead if that was what they wanted, and he saw the skull. Suddenly he put the gun down. He picked up the skull. He turned the skull over. He looked at the teeth. Then he went to the mirror. He held the skull up, looking in the mirror. He pressed the skull against his cheek. Beside his own face, the grinning skull leered back at him. Beside his skull, against his living flesh. He bared his teeth. And he knew. It was his own skull that he held. He was the one who would die. He was the founder. After a time he put the skull down. For a few minutes he stood at the controls, playing with them idly. He could hear the sound of motors outside, the muffled noise of men. Should he go back to the present, where the speaker waited? He could escape, of course. Escape? He turned toward the skull. There it was, his skull, yellow with age. Escape? Escape when he had held it in his own hands? What did it matter if he put it off a month, a year, 10 years, even 50? Time was nothing. He had sipped chocolate with a girl born 150 years before his time. Escape? For a little while, perhaps. But he could not really escape, no more so than anyone else had ever escaped or ever would. Only he had held it in his hands, his own bones, his own death's head. They had not. He went out the door and across the field empty-handed. There were a lot of them standing around, gathered together, waiting. They expected a good fight. They knew he had something. They had heard about the incident at the fountain. And there were plenty of police with guns and tear gas, creeping across the hills and ridges between the trees, closer and closer. It was an old story in this century. One of the men tossed something at him. It fell in the snow by his feet and he looked down. It was a rock. He smiled. "Come on," one of them called. "Don't you have any bombs?" "Throw a bomb. You with the beard. Throw a bomb." "Let 'em have it." "Toss a few A-bombs." They began to laugh. He smiled. He put his hands to his hips. They suddenly turned silent, seeing that he was going to speak. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I don't have any bombs. You're mistaken." There was a flurry of murmuring. "I have a gun," he went on. "A very good one. Made by science even more advanced than your own. But I'm not going to use that either." They were puzzled. "Why not?" someone called. At the edge of the group an older woman was watching. He felt a sudden shock. He had seen her before. Where? He remembered. The day at the library. As he had turned the corner he had seen her. She had noticed him and been astounded. At the time he did not understand why. Conger grinned. So he would escape death, the man who right now was voluntarily accepting it. They were laughing at a man who had a gun but didn't use it. But by a strange twist of science he would appear again a few months later, after his bones had been buried under the floor of a jail. And so, in a fashion, he would escape death. He would die, but then, after a period of months, he would live again, briefly, for an afternoon. An afternoon. Yet long enough for them to see him, to understand that he was still alive, to know that somehow he had returned to life. And then, finally, he would appear once more, after 200 years had passed, 2 centuries later. He would be born again, born, as a matter of fact, in a small trading village on Mars. He would grow up learning to hunt and trade. A police car came on the edge of the field and stopped. The people retreated a little. Conger raised his hands. "I have an odd paradox for you," he said. "Those who take lives will lose their own. Those who kill will die. But he who gives his own life away will live again." They laughed faintly, nervously. The police were coming out, walking toward him. He smiled. He had said everything he intended to say. It was a good little paradox he had coined. They would puzzle over it, remember it. Smiling, Conger awaited a death foreordained. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the stories, there are plenty more on the channel already released, and many coming soon. So make sure to subscribe and support the channel. Thanks. And if you're interested in narrations of fall novels, voting on which novels I read next, and ad-free audio and video versions of all stories, take a look at my Patreon page. You can get all those things and support me as a creator for just $4 a month. So head over to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky SFF, link in the description. Thanks, and until next time, happy listening.